Some maps are drawn to hide things, not reveal them. The San Juan Islands sit in the cold water between Washington State and Vancouver Island, a scattered archipelago of forested ridges and rocky shorelines where the border between nations blurs into fog and tide. Speeden Island is among the smaller landmasses in the chain, roughly 500 acres of windswept bluffs and thin soil, uninhabited except for seasonal grazing and the occasional research team. It has been surveyed dozens of times since the 1800s. Ships pass it daily. Fishermen know its contours by heart. But for a brief window in the summer of 1947, the island was not the shape anyone remembers. The chart in question was filed with the United States Coast and Geodetic Survey on July 9th of that year. It was one of hundreds produced during a routine update of navigation aids following World War II, when military shipping lanes were being returned to civilian traffic and older surveys were being replaced with newer instruments. The cartographer assigned to the region was a man named Vincent Holbrook, a civil servant with 16 years of experience and a reputation for precision. His work had guided minesweepers through the Aleutians. He did not make mistakes. The map he submitted showed Speeden Island with a peninsula extending from its northwestern shore, a narrow strip of land roughly 300 yards long, terminating in a shallow cove. The feature was labeled in Holbrook's neat hand as West Bit and marked with standard symbols for rocky terrain and tidal exposure. Depth soundings were recorded around it. Magnetic variation was noted. It looked in every respect like a permanent geographic feature that had always been there, except it had not. The anomaly was discovered in late August when a commercial fishing captain named Raymond Itzkoff filed a complaint with the Coast Guard. His boat, the Marjorie Fay, had run aground attempting to navigate around the peninsula shown on Holbrook's chart. Itzkoff's crew spent 2 hours refloating the vessel during low tide and reported no sign of the landmass depicted in the survey. A Coast Guard cutter was dispatched to verify. The crew found nothing. Holbrook's chart was compared against older maps dating back to 1883. None showed the spit. By mid-September, the chart had been pulled from circulation. A corrected version was issued on October 4th, showing Speeden Island in its familiar configuration. The incident was logged as a drafting error. Vincent Holbrook was reassigned to an administrative position in Washington, D.C., and no formal inquiry was opened. But 3 fishing boats had been there that summer, and their logs told a different story. The first was the Ida Rose, captained by Edwin Lowell, a third-generation fisherman from Anacortes. His logbook entry for June 27, 1947, describes anchoring in a new cove on Speeden's north end to repair a fuel line. Lowell noted the cove's depth as 12 feet at high tide and recorded pulling up rock samples that he described as black and glassy like slag. He noted tide pools along the rocks that seemed to fill and drain backward from the moon, though he admitted in a later statement that he may have been mistaken about the timing. The second vessel, the Olsen Girl, was a seiner, working the strait in early July. First Mate Arthur Brigham wrote in his personal journal about stopping at the new finger of land past the bluffs to stretch his legs. He described the tide pools in similar terms, strange, inverted rhythms, and mentioned finding dozens of small crabs moving in circles, all the same direction, all at once. He took a photograph. The image shows Brigham standing on dark rocks with water behind him, but the shoreline is indistinct, overexposed by the bright sky. The third boat was the Marjorie Fay. Raymond Itzkoff's official report to the Coast Guard includes a single line. Anchored at the spit marked on Chart 713 for the night of July 19th. No trouble. Fished the next morning and left. When interviewed years later by a regional historian, Itzkoff was reluctant to elaborate. He said only that the water near the spit had been too still and that his crew had not slept well. He would not explain further. All three captains confirmed seeing the peninsula. All three described it in similar terms. Narrow, low to the water, composed of black or dark gray stone, not common to the other islands. And all three mentioned the tide pools, always the tide pools, always moving wrong. When asked directly whether he believed the landmass had been real, Edwin Lowell paused for a long time before answering. "I've fished these islands my whole life," he said. "I know what's real, but I also know what I saw, and I know it's not there now." The Coast Guard's internal review was brief. A 2-page memorandum dated September 23, 1947, concluded that Holbrook had likely incorporated data from an outdated Russian chart produced during the 19th century, when imperial surveys of the region were less reliable. The memo acknowledged the reports from Lowell, Brigham, and Itzkoff, but dismissed them as confusion caused by unusual tidal conditions and the poor quality of navigational charts available to civilian vessels at the time. No evidence of a peninsula was found during aerial reconnaissance conducted in October. The case was closed. Vincent Holbrook never spoke publicly about the chart. Colleagues at the Coast and Geodetic Survey described him as withdrawn after the reassignment, unwilling to discuss his work in the San Juans. He retired in 1952 and moved to a small house outside Olympia. On the night of March 14, 1953, the house burned to the ground. Holbrook was found dead in the remains of his study. The fire marshal's report listed the cause as accidental, likely a kerosene heater, but noted that Holbrook's file cabinets had been opened and most of their contents destroyed. Maps, field notes, and correspondence were reduced to ash. His widow, Margaret Holbrook, gave a single interview to a local newspaper 3 weeks after the fire. She said her husband had been distracted in the months before his death, often waking in the night to check and recheck old survey notes. She described finding him once at the kitchen table with a dozen charts spread out, tracing coastlines with his finger as though searching for something that should have been there. When asked what he was looking for, she said he never told her, but she remembered one thing he said late one evening, staring at a map of the San Juans. "He told me there were places that didn't want to be drawn," she said, "and that drawing them anyway had consequences." No investigation into the fire revealed evidence of foul play. Margaret Holbrook moved east to live with family. She died in 1971. The maps Vincent Holbrook had been studying were never recovered. In the decades since, Speeden Island has been surveyed more than 30 times. Satellite imaging, sonar, and LIDAR have mapped every inch of its coastline. No peninsula has ever appeared. The northwestern shore remains a continuous curve of bluff and stone, unchanged since the first European expeditions charted the strait. But fishermen still talk. Old-timers in Anacortes and Friday Harbor will tell you, quietly, that the waters north of Speeden are different. Not dangerous, just different. The tide doesn't pull quite right. The water is darker. Some claim their depth sounders show readings that don't match the charts, or that their GPS drifts by a few dozen yards when they pass that stretch of coast. None of it is enough to report. None of it is enough to prove. In 2004, a graduate student in cartographic history named Laura Fenimore wrote her thesis on discrepancies in mid-century Coast Guard charts. She obtained copies of Holbrook's original map through a Freedom of Information Act request and compared it against modern satellite data. Her conclusion was straightforward. The peninsula had never existed. Holbrook had likely made an error transferring data from field notes or misinterpreted sonar readings in poor weather. But Fenimore included a footnote. She had interviewed Edwin Lowell's son, Michael, who still lived in Anacortes and kept his father's old logbooks. One entry, dated August 2, 1947, weeks after the complaints began, described returning to Speeden to see if the spit was still there. It was not. But Lowell had written something else. A single line at the bottom of the page in handwriting that looked hurried. The rocks remember, even if the maps don't. The San Juan Islands are still surveyed. Ships still pass. And Speeden Island remains where it has always been, except perhaps for one summer in 1947 when it was briefly something else. The Coast Guard keeps no record of why Holbrook's map was removed so quickly. No explanation was ever required. And the 3 fishing boats that anchored in a cove that does not exist have long since been decommissioned. Their logs filed away in storage facilities no one visits anymore. But the tide still moves along that northern shore, and if you watch it carefully, some say, it still moves wrong. There are places where sound goes to die, and sometimes it takes something with it. Bell Rock is not an island. It is a submerged reef that rises from the seabed 3 miles northwest of Lopez Island in the San Juan Archipelago, breaking the surface only at the lowest tides. The rock earned its name in 1892 when a navigation bell was mounted on a steel tower bolted to its highest point, a warning to ships entering the narrow passage between Lopez and San Juan Island. The bell rang with the motion of the waves, a steady mechanical rhythm that sailors learned to listen for when fog swallowed the strait. Over the decades, the system expanded. A foghorn was added in 1928. Automated buoys were placed in a ring around the reef beginning in 1956, each equipped with bells, horns, and later radio beacons. By the early 1980s, Bell Rock was surrounded by 7 active warning stations, all synchronized to NOAA's Pacific Maritime Network. The area was considered one of the most thoroughly monitored shipping channels in the region. On the night of October 16, 1983, a storm moved through the strait with winds reaching 40 knots and visibility dropping below 50 feet. 4 vessels were navigating the passage that night: the container ship Astrid Maersk, the Coast Guard cutter Point Barrow, the fishing trawler Salish Dawn, and a private sailboat named Wayfarer. All 4 were equipped with functioning radios and radar. All 4 were listening for the warning signals around Bell Rock. At 11:27 p.m., the signals stopped. The first to notice was the helmsman aboard the Astrid Maersk, a Danish-flagged cargo vessel making the run from Seattle to Vancouver. Third Officer Henrik Sorensen was on watch, navigating by radar and listening to the automated foghorn sequence broadcast from the Bell Rock station. He had passed through the channel dozens of times. He knew the rhythm by heart. 3 blasts every 30 seconds, steady as a metronome. At 11:27, the foghorn cut out mid-blast. Sorensen checked his instruments. The radio beacon was gone. The radar showed the rock's position clearly, but no audible signal accompanied it. He reduced speed and called down to the captain, who came to the bridge within 2 minutes. Together, they attempted to contact the Coast Guard station on San Juan Island. The radio worked. The transmission went through, but there was no response. Aboard the Point Barrow, Lieutenant Commander Marion Teague had noticed the same thing. Her cutter was running a routine patrol and had been tracking the buoys by sound and signal for the past hour. When the warning systems went silent, she ordered an immediate check of the ship's communications equipment. Everything functioned normally. The silence, she realized, was external. The Salish Dawn and the Wayfarer both reported the same experience in later statements. The warnings had been there, and then they were not. No static, no gradual fade, just silence. What happened next was harder to explain. Sorensen, the officer aboard the Astrid Maersk, was the first to mention it in his official log. He described hearing a low vibration, almost subsonic, like the hum of a generator running underwater. He felt it as much as heard it, a pressure in his chest, a faint resonance that seemed to come from below the ship rather than around it. He noted the time as 11:29 p.m. Lieutenant Commander Teague reported the same phenomenon 2 minutes later. She described it as a mechanical drone, constant and even, with no variation in pitch. Her crew heard it too. One sailor compared it to the sound of a distant turbine. Another said it reminded him of a submarine's engine, though no submarines were known to be operating in the area. The captain of the Salish Dawn, a man named Douglas Alvarez, logged the sound as well. He wrote that it seemed to rise from the water itself, not from any direction you could point to. He reduced his engine to idle to hear it better. His crew gathered on deck. They stood in the rain and fog, listening to something they could not locate. Aboard the Wayfarer, a retired schoolteacher named Judith Kaminsky was alone at the helm. She later described the sound in a letter to a friend as unnatural, like the ocean was breathing through a metal pipe. She said it made her feel watched, though she could see nothing beyond the bow of her boat. The hum lasted for 9 minutes. At 11:38 p.m., it stopped. 30 seconds later, the foghorns and warning bells resumed their normal patterns. The radio beacons came back online. The Point Barrow re-established contact with the Coast Guard station on San Juan Island. Everything returned to normal. The storm passed by dawn. The 4 ships continued to their destinations without further incident. By the morning of October 17th, the event had been logged by all 4 vessels and transmitted to the Coast Guard District Office in Seattle. The official response came within 3 days. NOAA reviewed the telemetry data from all 7 warning stations around Bell Rock. According to their records, no equipment had malfunctioned. The foghorns had operated continuously. The buoys had transmitted without interruption. The radio beacons had remained active throughout the night. Every automated system showed green across all diagnostics. When presented with the ship logs, NOAA's regional coordinator, a man named Gordon Whitfield, suggested that atmospheric conditions during the storm may have created an acoustic shadow, a phenomenon where sound waves are deflected or absorbed by layers of differing air pressure. He acknowledged that such shadows were rare and difficult to predict, but insisted that the equipment had functioned as designed. The explanation satisfied no one. Henrik Sorensen, the officer from the Astrid Maersk, was interviewed by a maritime safety investigator in November. He was asked if he could have been mistaken about the timing or the silence. He said he could not. The investigator asked if the storm might have drowned out the foghorns. Sorensen pointed out that his ship's radar had been clear, and he had been standing in a fully enclosed bridge with insulated walls. He would have heard the horns. He always heard the horns. And the other sound? The investigator asked. Sorensen paused. I don't know what that was, he said, but it was there. And it was not wind. It was not the ship. It was something else. Lieutenant Commander Teague submitted a more detailed account to her commanding officer. In it, she noted that 2 members of her crew had checked the sonar during the event. The sonar showed no large objects beneath the cutter. No whales, no submarines, no geological features that could produce such a sound. The water below them had been empty. Douglas Alvarez, the fishing captain, was less formal in his response. When asked about the hum by a reporter from a local maritime newsletter, he said simply, I've been on this water for 30 years. I know what everything sounds like. That wasn't anything I've heard before, and I don't care what NOAA says. Their equipment didn't work that night. Judith Kaminsky, the sailor aboard the Wayfarer, never spoke to investigators. She sold her boat the following spring and moved inland. A neighbor later recalled her saying she didn't want to be on that water after dark anymore. The Coast Guard conducted a brief inspection of the Bell Rock warning stations in late October. Technicians found all equipment in working order. No signs of damage. No evidence of tampering. A follow-up review in December confirmed the same findings. NOAA issued a final report in January 1984, concluding that the incident was the result of anomalous atmospheric propagation and required no further action. The case was closed, but the silence was not forgotten. In the years that followed, other crews reported similar experiences near Bell Rock, though none as complete or as well documented. In 1987, a tugboat operator claimed the foghorn went quiet for a minute or two during a crossing, but he filed no formal report. In 1991, a sailboat captain mentioned in a harbormaster's log that the buoys near Bell Rock had sounded wrong, though he could not describe how. In 2003, a marine biologist conducting surveys in the area noted that her hydrophone recordings contained an unidentified low-frequency tone near the reef, but she attributed it to equipment interference. None of these incidents were investigated. None were compared to the events of October 1983, and none of the witnesses ever said the word that Henrik Sorensen had used in his original statement: deliberate. He had told the investigator that the hum sounded deliberate, not mechanical, not natural, deliberate, as though something had chosen to replace the warnings with a signal of its own. The investigator had not included that detail in the final report. Bell Rock remains an active navigation hazard. The warning systems still operate. Ships still pass in the fog, listening for the bells and horns that guide them through the dark. And on certain nights when the wind is strong and the visibility drops to nothing, some crews will tell you the warnings sound different than they should. Not louder, not quieter, just different, like they are covering something up. Animals do not forget their paths, but sometimes they follow ones that were never taught. Lime Kiln Point sits on the western shore of San Juan Island, a rocky headland that juts into Harrow Strait, where the cold Pacific Current narrows between Washington State and Vancouver Island. The point takes its name from the old limestone kilns built there in the 1860s, stone furnaces that once burned rock into mortar for frontier settlements. The kilns are long cold, but the point remains a place of passage. Orcas travel these waters in summer, following the Chinook salmon that move through the strait in waves so dense they darken the surface. The state park, established there in 1984, became one of the best land-based whale-watching sites in North America. Researchers from the University of Washington and the National Marine Fisheries Service set up monitoring stations along the rocky beach, recording the movements and vocalizations of the southern resident orcapods that returned each year. The whales were predictable. Their routes were known. Their behaviors had been cataloged for decades. Until July 12, 1991, when 23 of them stopped moving forward and began to circle. The observation began at 8:15 in the morning. Dr. Elliot Varnado, a marine mammal biologist conducting his third summer of fieldwork at Lime Kiln, was the first to notice the deviation. He had been tracking J-Pod, a family group of 18 orcas, as they traveled south along the coastline. The whales were expected to continue past the point and into the open strait, following the salmon migration as they did every year. Instead, they slowed. At 8:22, the lead matriarch turned west, away from the shore, and began swimming in a wide, slow arc. The rest of the pod followed. Within 10 minutes, all 18 whales were moving in a circular pattern approximately 200 yards offshore. The circle was nearly perfect. Varnado noted the behavior in his field journal and radioed the other research teams stationed along the coast. By 9 a.m., 5 more orcas from K-Pod had joined the formation. They slipped into the rotation without disrupting the pattern, spacing themselves evenly among the others. The circle continued. No whales broke away. No vocalizations were recorded that matched typical hunting or social calls. The hydrophones picked up only a steady, rhythmic clicking. Short pulses at intervals Varnado described as mechanical. The salmon were there. Sonar showed dense schools passing directly beneath the circling whales. The orcas ignored them. Researchers gathered along the shore. Word spread through the marine biology community, and by noon 12 scientists from various institutions had arrived with cameras, hydrophones, and telemetry equipment. They documented the event from multiple angles. The whales continued to circle. The pattern did not waver. 4 hours passed. At 12:17 p.m., the Sausu circle dissolved. The whales resumed their southern migration as if nothing had occurred. They traveled in their usual formation, vocalizing normally, and were observed hunting salmon near Cattle Point by mid-afternoon. By evening, both pods had left the strait entirely. Dr. Varnado filed a detailed report with the National Marine Fisheries Service on July 15th. He included timestamps, GPS coordinates, hydrophone recordings, and photographs. He noted that the behavior matched no known orca activity in the scientific literature. Circling behavior had been observed before, but only during coordinated hunting or play, and never for 4 hours, never in perfect geometric formation, and never while ignoring abundant prey. The coordinates were precise: 48 degrees, 31 minutes north, 123 degrees, 9 minutes west, roughly 200 yards offshore from the old lime kilns. 3 years later, it happened again. On July 12, 1994, at 8:19 a.m., J-Pod approached Lime Kiln Point from the north. Dr. Varnado was there. He had returned to the site every summer since 1991, waiting. When the lead matriarch turned west and began the same slow arc, he activated every recording device he had brought. 23 whales circled for 4 hours and 6 minutes. The GPS coordinates matched the previous event within 3 meters. The hydrophone recordings captured the same rhythmic clicking pattern. Identical intervals, identical duration. Varnado compared the audio files later. The sequences were not similar. They were exact. He was not the only one watching this time. A team from the University of British Columbia had joined him, along with 2 documentary filmmakers and a reporter from the Seattle Times. They recorded everything. The whales circled. The salmon passed beneath them. The clicks continued, steady and precise, like a signal repeating on a loop. At 12:25 p.m., the whales stopped and resumed their migration south. The reporter's article ran on July 16, 1994, under the headline, "Orcas Perform Mysterious Dance Off San Juan Island." It described the event in detail and included quotes from Dr. Varnado, who admitted he had no explanation. The piece was picked up by the Associated Press and reprinted in papers across the country. Marine biology journals requested Varnado's data. The National Marine Fisheries Service opened a formal inquiry, and then the story went quiet. Varnado submitted his findings to the Journal of Cetacean Research in October 1994. The paper was peer-reviewed and accepted for publication. It included acoustic analysis, behavioral observations, and a comparison of the 2 events. The journal scheduled it for the March 1995 issue. 2 weeks before publication, the article was pulled. The editor, Dr. Samuel Orendane, sent a brief letter to Varnado stating that further review raised questions about the interpretation of the data and that publication would be postponed indefinitely. Varnado contacted Orendane directly. According to a letter Varnado later shared with colleagues, Orendane told him the decision had come from above, pressure from federal agencies that funded much of the journal's research. Orendane did not elaborate. He suggested Varnado resubmit to a different publication. Varnado tried. No journal accepted the paper. The National Marine Fisheries Service completed its inquiry in January 1995. The report, obtained years later through a Freedom of Information Act request, concluded that the behavior was anomalous but not indicative of distress or environmental disruption. It suggested the whales may have been engaged in a complex social interaction not yet understood by current research models. The report recommended continued monitoring but allocated no additional funding. The case was closed. Dr. Varnado remained at Limekiln Point every summer through 2002. He monitored the same coordinates. He recorded every orca that passed. The behavior never repeated. The whales followed their usual migration routes, hunting salmon and traveling in predictable patterns. Whatever had occurred on those 2 July mornings seemed to be finished, but the recordings remained. In 2007, Dr. Anja Peltonen, a bioacoustics researcher at the University of Iceland, obtained copies of Varnado's hydrophone files and ran them through spectral analysis software that had not existed in the 1990s. Her findings, published in a little-read Scandinavian Marine Science Journal, noted that the clicking patterns contained embedded periodicities inconsistent with biological origin. She suggested the sounds may have been produced by the whales in response to an external acoustic source, something in the water that prompted them to reply. She could not identify what that source might have been. No ships had been in the area. No sonar equipment had been active. The U.S. Navy confirmed no submarine activity near the San Juanes on either date. Peltonen's paper received minimal attention. Varnado, by then retired, sent her a letter thanking her for the work. In it, he mentioned that he had always suspected the whales were not communicating with each other. They were listening to something, he wrote, and whatever it was, it only spoke twice. The southern resident orcas still pass Limekiln Point every summer. Tourists gather on the rocks to watch them. Researchers continue to monitor their movements and health, tracking the decline of the pods as salmon populations dwindle and the strait grows warmer. The whales are struggling. Their numbers are dropping. They are, in most respects, predictable and known. But some researchers still check the coordinates. On July 12th each year, a few scientists return to the point with hydrophones and cameras, just in case. They record the water. They watch the whales pass, and they listen for the clicks that sounded like a code no one could break. Dr. Varnado died in 2018. His field notes and recordings were donated to the University of Washington's Marine Biology Archive. A graduate student cataloging the collection in 2021 found something Varnado had never mentioned in his published work. Tucked into the back of his July 1994 field journal was a hand-drawn map of the strait. The GPS coordinates from both events were marked with a red X. Around the X, Varnado had sketched a series of concentric circles, dozens of them, radiating outward like ripples on still water. At the bottom of the page, he had written a single sentence. They were marking the center of something. Some things beneath the water have learned to reach up. Griffin Bay curves along the southern shore of San Juan Island, a sheltered crescent of cold salt water rimmed by rocky beaches and forests of Douglas fir. The bay has served as an anchorage since the mid-1800s, when British and American forces nearly went to war over a disputed pig and the question of who owned these islands. The conflict was resolved without bloodshed, and Griffin Bay became a quiet harbor for fishing boats, pleasure craft, and the occasional research vessel seeking calm water away from the stronger currents of Harrow Strait. The bay is not deep. Charts show an average depth of 30 to 40 feet across most of the anchorage, with a muddy bottom scattered with rock and the occasional remnant of old timber pilings from forgotten docks. It is easy water to anchor in. Sailors have done so for more than a century without incident. The holding is good, the weather is predictable, there is no reason for a well-set anchor to fail. But beginning in the summer of 2006, boats began reporting something else entirely. The first incident occurred on June 23rd. A 32-foot sloop named Wanderlust, owned by a retired engineer named Thomas Berkowitz, anchored in Griffin Bay for the night. Berkowitz had sailed the San Juans for 15 years and knew the bay well. He set his anchor in 35 feet of water at 6 p.m., checked the hold twice, and went below for dinner. The anchor held through the evening. The boat did not drift. The next morning, when Berkowitz attempted to raise the anchor, the chain would not come up. He motored forward, thinking he had snagged a rock or old cable. The chain remained taut. He reversed. Nothing changed. After 20 minutes of maneuvering, he dove to inspect the problem. What he found, he later described to the harbor master at Friday Harbor, made no sense. The anchor itself was free, resting on mud with no obstruction. But the chain, 30 feet of galvanized steel links, had been tied into a series of tight knots around a piece of driftwood embedded in the sea floor. The knots were precise. The wood had not been there when he anchored the night before. Berkowitz cut the chain and left the anchor behind. He filed a brief report with the port of Friday Harbor, but attributed the incident to vandalism, though he could not explain how anyone would have done it unnoticed in the middle of the night. 3 weeks later, it happened again. On July 14th, a 40-foot ketch called Seabird anchored near the western edge of Griffin Bay. The owner, a woman named Patricia Osmond, set her anchor in calm conditions just before sunset. She woke at dawn to find her chain knotted around what she described as a long piece of kelp that shouldn't have been there. The kelp was thick, fibrous, and tied through the chain in a pattern she did not recognize. She managed to untangle it, but the process took over an hour. She did not report the incident. By the end of summer 2006, 5 more boats had experienced similar problems. Chains knotted to driftwood. Chains wrapped around rocks that had not been in position the night before. Chains looped through themselves in configurations that required slack the boats had never given. The sailors compared notes in harbors and marinas. None could explain it. Most assumed equipment failure or bad luck. A few suspected pranksters, though no one could identify a motive or method. The incidents continued through 2007 and 2008. By the summer of 2009, 17 separate reports had been filed with the Port of Friday Harbor, the Coast Guard, and local sailing clubs. The reports shared common details: anchors set in Griffin Bay between dusk and midnight, chains found knotted or tangled by morning, no sounds or disturbances overnight. The knots varied, but all were described as tight, deliberate, and unlike anything the sailors recognized from nautical tradition. In August 2008, a commercial diver named Leonard Yoshida was hired by a frustrated boat owner to inspect an anchor that had been knotted to the seafloor for 3 days. Yoshida descended in clear water and spent 20 minutes examining the configuration. He surfaced and told the owner he would not touch it. It wasn't tied by someone who didn't know what they were doing, Yoshida said later in an interview with a boating magazine. It was tied by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The knots were clean, symmetrical, like they'd been measured, and the driftwood they were tied to, it was fresh. No barnacles, no algae, like it had been placed there that night. When asked if he thought someone was sabotaging boats, Yoshida paused. "I don't know how you do that without being seen or heard," he said. "These people were on their boats all night, and the water's not that deep. You'd need lights. You'd make noise. No one saw anything." The Port of Friday Harbor contacted the Coast Guard in September 2008. A formal inquiry was opened. Investigators reviewed the reports, interviewed sailors, and inspected anchor chains that had been cut free and brought to shore. The knots were documented and photographed. They matched no known maritime practice. Some resembled traditional reef knots or bowlines, but others were more complex, interlocking loops and twists that seemed designed to hold under tension but release cleanly when pulled from a specific angle. A specialist in maritime rigging, brought in to consult, stated that the knots were functional but unusual. He noted that several of them required the rope or chain to be threaded through in ways that would be impossible unless the material was free on both ends. The chains, however, had remained attached to the boats throughout the incidents. In November 2008, the Coast Guard requested assistance from the U.S. Navy. A dive team from Naval Base Kitsap arrived in Griffin Bay in early December and conducted a 3-day survey of the sea floor. The team used sonar, underwater cameras, and manual inspection to map the areas where the incidents had occurred. They documented the terrain, collected samples of sediment and plant material, and interviewed local divers. Their report was submitted to the Coast Guard on January 8, 2009. It was not made public. A 2-paragraph summary released to the Port of Friday Harbor stated that the team had found no evidence of human activity or artificial structures, and that the incidents were likely caused by natural entanglement with driftwood and kelp, influenced by tidal currents. The report recommended no further action. Thomas Berkowitz, the first sailor to report the phenomenon, requested a copy of the full Navy report through a Freedom of Information Act, filing in March 2009. His request was denied. The Navy classified the report as operationally sensitive and provided no additional explanation. The incident stopped in the fall of 2009. No further reports of knotted anchor chains were filed in Griffin Bay after October of that year. Boats continued to anchor there without issue. The bay returned to its reputation as a safe and predictable harbor. But the sailors who experienced the knots did not forget. Patricia Osmond, the owner of Seabird, refused to anchor in Griffin Bay again. She told a reporter in 2010 that she no longer trusted the water there. "It wasn't random," she said. "Something down there knows how to tie knots. And I don't care if that sounds crazy, I know what I saw." Leonard Yoshida, the diver, was more measured in his assessment. When asked in 2012 if he had any theories about what had caused the phenomenon, he said only that he had stopped taking jobs in Griffin Bay. "I've dove all over these islands," he said. "I've seen plenty of weird things, old wrecks, strange rock formations, places where the current doesn't make sense. But Griffin Bay is the only place I've dove where I felt like I wasn't alone." The Navy's refusal to release its findings fueled speculation. Some sailors believed the team had discovered evidence of underwater training exercises or experimental equipment that the military did not want publicized. Others suggested the presence of classified sensors or monitoring devices on the seafloor. A few, including Berkowitz, believed the Navy had found something they could not explain and chose silence over admission. In 2015, a graduate student in marine biology at the University of Washington named Angela Ruiz conducted a thesis project on tidal patterns and sediment distribution in the San Juan Islands. As part of her research, she obtained historical survey data for Griffin Bay and compared it to modern sonar scans. She noticed a discrepancy. Between 2006 and 2009, the seafloor in the area where the knotting incidents occurred showed signs of regular disturbance, smooth patches where sediment had been displaced, faint linear depressions that did not match natural formations. The disturbances ended in late 2009. Ruiz's thesis included the observation, but offered no explanation. Her advisor suggested she remove the section. She did. Griffin Bay remains a popular anchorage. On summer evenings, a dozen boats or more will swing on their anchors there, lights glowing on the water, sailors enjoying the calm. The charts are accurate. The holding is good. The bay has no reputation for danger, but some sailors still avoid it. And at the Port of Friday Harbor, tucked into a filing cabinet in the harbor master's office, there is a folder marked Griffin Bay Anchor Incidents 2006-2009. Inside are 17 reports, a dozen photographs of knotted chains, and a single handwritten note from the Coast Guard liaison who closed the case. The note reads, "Incident ceased without explanation. No evidence of criminal activity. Recommend no further investigation. Beneath it, someone had added a second line in pencil, later erased, but still faintly visible. They stopped because they finished. There are places where your voice goes out and something else brings it back. Cattle Point occupies the southeastern tip of San Juan Island, a windswept promontory of rock and grass where the land gives way to the cold waters of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. The lighthouse there has stood since 1935, a squat white tower that marks the boundary between sheltered island passages and the open ocean beyond. The point takes its name from the Hudson's Bay Company cattle that grazed the area in the 1840s, before the border was drawn and the islands became American territory. It is a place of edges, land meets water, calm meets current. The wind comes off the Pacific unbroken, carrying salt and the smell of kelp. On clear days, you can see the Olympic Mountains to the south and the Canadian Gulf Islands to the north. The point is popular with hikers and bird watchers who follow the trails that wind through the grass and along the bluffs. The lighthouse itself is automated, unmanned since the 1970s. There are no buildings nearby. No roads lead directly to the shore. The acoustic phenomenon was first documented in April 1997, though locals suggest it may have been occurring long before that. A couple from Seattle, David and Rachel Tremaine, were hiking the trail that circles the point on the afternoon of April 19th. The weather was clear, the wind moderate. They stopped near the lighthouse to rest and admire the view. David made a comment about the color of the water. Rachel laughed and replied. They continued talking for a few minutes, standing near the edge of the bluff and facing southeast toward the open strait. Then they heard themselves. David's comment about the water came back to them, his exact words, in his exact voice, spoken from somewhere out over the ocean. Rachel's laugh followed. Then her reply. The conversation repeated in full, word for word, as if it were being played from a recording. But the sound was not mechanical. It was clear and natural, carried on the wind like an echo. Except it came 40 seconds after they had spoken. The Tremaines stood in silence, listening. When they spoke again, David asking if Rachel had heard it too, the question returned to them 40 seconds later. They tested it. David counted aloud. Rachel recited part of a poem. Every sound they made facing southeast was repeated exactly 40 seconds later, arriving from the direction of the open water. They tried facing other directions, north, west, south. The echo did not occur. Only when facing southeast toward the strait did their voices return. The Tremaines mentioned the experience to a ranger at the San Juan Island National Historical Park Visitor Center the following day. The ranger, a man named Stephen Woodall, had worked on the island for 6 years and had never heard of such a phenomenon. He made a note in the daily log, but did not investigate further. The Tremaines returned home and told friends about the strange echo at Cattle Point. Most assumed they had misheard the wind, but others began to notice. In June 1997, a birdwatcher named Carla Imbuende visited Cattle Point to observe nesting gulls. She brought a voice recorder to log her observations. When she reviewed the tape later, she found her spoken notes repeated twice, once in real time and again 40 seconds later, faint but distinct. She had been facing southeast when recording. In August, a family from Portland reported the same experience. The father, Alan Navarro, described it in a letter to the Park Service as unnerving but precise. His children had been frightened by hearing their own voices return from the water. Navarro timed the delay with his watch. 40 seconds. By the end of 1997, 12 separate reports had been filed with the Park Service, all describing the same phenomenon. The delay was always 40 seconds. The echo only occurred when facing southeast. And the returned sound was never distorted. It was clear, accurate, and unmistakable. Stephen Woodall, the ranger, visited Cattle Point in September to test the reports himself. He brought a stopwatch and a colleague, another ranger named Denise Kowalski. They stood near the lighthouse and spoke aloud. The echo returned. Woodall timed it, 40 seconds. They moved to different locations around the point. The effect persisted in the same direction, always southeast, always 40 seconds. Woodall filed a formal report with the Park Service in October. He noted that the phenomenon had no obvious explanation and recommended a professional acoustic study. The report was forwarded to the National Park Service Regional Office in Seattle. No immediate action was taken. In March 1998, Dr. Philip Sorensen, an acoustic engineer from the University of Washington, visited Cattle Point with a team of graduate students. Sorensen had worked on environmental sound studies for over 20 years and had investigated natural echo phenomena in canyons, caves, and coastal formations. He arrived with recording equipment, spectrum analyzers, and a detailed understanding of how sound behaves in open landscapes. His team spent 4 days at the point. They recorded sounds from multiple positions, measured wind speed and direction, and mapped the surrounding terrain. They tested the echo at different times of day and under varying weather conditions. The phenomenon occurred consistently. 40 seconds, southeast, clear and precise. Sorensen's findings, published in a brief article in the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America in November 1998, were inconclusive. He confirmed the echo was real and measurable but could not explain it. Natural acoustic reflections required a solid surface to bounce sound back to the source. The open strait offered no such surface. The nearest landmass to the southeast was more than 15 miles away, far too distant to produce an echo with a 40-second delay. Sound traveling at normal speed would take several minutes to cover that distance and return. Sorensen ruled out atmospheric ducting, a phenomenon where temperature layers can channel sound over long distances. The effect at Cattle Point occurred regardless of temperature or humidity. He ruled out subsurface reflections. Sonar mapping of the seafloor showed no unusual formations that could redirect sound waves. He tested for human-made sources, ships, buoys, underwater sensors. None were present in the area. His conclusion was careful. The phenomenon is consistent and repeatable, but the mechanism responsible remains unclear. Further study is warranted. No further study was conducted. The Park Service acknowledged Sorensen's report, but allocated no funding for additional research. The phenomenon was noted in internal documents as an unexplained acoustic anomaly of low priority. Rangers continued to receive occasional reports from visitors, but the echo was not publicized. It did not appear in park brochures or interpretive materials. Tourists who experienced it were told it was likely a quirk of wind and terrain. Sorensen himself remained puzzled. In a letter to a colleague in 2001, he wrote, "I've worked with echoes my entire career. I know how sound travels. What's happening at Cattle Point should not be possible with the available surfaces and distances involved. The delay is too precise. The clarity is too high. It's as if something out there is listening and repeating, not reflecting." Over the years, other researchers visited the point. A team from the Naval Postgraduate School conducted acoustic tests in 2004. Their report was classified. A professor of geophysics from the University of British Columbia visited in 2007 and confirmed the phenomenon but offered no explanation. A documentary crew filming a piece on unusual natural phenomena recorded the echo in 2011. The footage aired once on a regional cable channel and was not widely seen. The locals, those who live year-round on San Juan Island, have their own theories. Some say the echo has always been there, long before anyone thought to measure it. Others claim it started after the lighthouse was automated in the 70s. as if the absence of human presence allowed something else to fill the silence. A few older residents recall stories from the 1950s told by fishermen who worked the waters off Cattle Point and reported hearing voices on the wind, voices that sounded like their own but came from the wrong direction. One story, recounted by a retired fisherman named Harold Estrada in 2009, described an incident from 1953. Estrada's father had been working a line near the point when he heard someone calling his name. He looked around. No boats were nearby. The voice called again. His own voice, he realized, saying his own name. He left the area and did not return. Estrada did not know if the story was true, but he knew his father had refused to fish near Cattle Point for the rest of his life. The echo still occurs. Hikers still report it, though fewer than before. Most visitors to Cattle Point are unaware of the phenomenon and do not think to test it. Those who do often dismiss it as wind or imagination. But for those who stand at the edge, face southeast, and speak into the open strait, the experience remains the same. 40 seconds later, the words return. Always clear, always exact, always 40 seconds. Dr. Sorensen died in 2016. His notes and recordings from Cattle Point were archived at the University of Washington but have not been reviewed. The Park Service still receives occasional inquiries about the echo. The standard response is that it is a natural acoustic effect under investigation, though no investigation has been active for over a decade. In 2019, a journalist from a Pacific Northwest magazine visited Cattle Point to write a feature on the island's lesser-known mysteries. She stood near the lighthouse, faced southeast, and spoke a single sentence. "Is anyone out there?" 40 seconds later, the question returned. She did not write the article. Some populations exist only long enough to be counted once. Orcas Island is the largest of the San Juan Islands, a horseshoe-shaped landmass of dense forest and rocky coastline that rises from the cold waters of Puget Sound. The island's permanent population has never been large. Fishermen, farmers, and artists drawn to the isolation and beauty of the place. By the mid-20th century, most residents lived in or near the village of East Sound, clustered around the horseshoe's inner curve, where the harbor provided shelter and access to the mainland. The eastern shore, by contrast, was and remains largely undeveloped. Steep bluffs drop to narrow beaches, accessible only by boat or rough trail. The forest is thick, Douglas fir, western red cedar, salal choking the understory. A few summer cabins dot the coastline, but no roads reach them. No power lines, no infrastructure. It is a place that has resisted settlement, too rugged and remote for all but the most determined. The 1960 United States Census was conducted between April and July of that year. The process on Orcas Island was handled by a single enumerator, a man named Gerald Pitkin, who had been assigned the task of visiting every residence and recording the names, ages, and occupations of all inhabitants. Pitkin was thorough. His handwritten field notes, preserved in the National Archives, show meticulous attention to detail, addresses, landmarks, notes on how to reach isolated homes. On June 14, 1960, Pitkin recorded visits to 18 households along the eastern shore of Orcas Island. The households contained a total of 247 individuals. He listed their names: Alvarez, Bergstrom, Dalton, Estrada, Fujimoto, Gagnon, Howell, Ibarra, Jankowski, Korhonen, Larkin, Mendez, Novak, O'Malley, Petrov, Quigley, Russo, Salazar, Tanaka, Upton, Voss, Whitmore, Yamamoto, and Zhao. He noted their occupations: fishermen, net menders, boat builders. He described the settlement as a fishing community along the eastern bluffs, accessible by trail from Point Lawrence. The data was filed with the Census Bureau Regional Office in Seattle in August 1960 and incorporated into the official records. The population of Orcas Island was recorded as 1,392, including the 247 residents of the Eastern Shore community. But in the 1970 census, they were gone. The enumerator assigned to Orcas Island in 1970, a woman named Dorothy Keene, found no settlement on the Eastern Shore. She walked the trails Pitkin had described. She found no homes, no docks, no evidence of recent habitation. Her field notes dated May 7, 1970 state, checked Eastern Shore per 1960 records, no structures found, possible seasonal fishing camp, now abandoned. Keene contacted the Census Regional Office to clarify. A supervisor reviewed Pitkin's 1960 records and compared them to property tax rolls and school enrollment records from San Juan County. No properties on the Eastern Shore matched the addresses Pitkin had listed. No children with the surnames he recorded had attended the island school. No fishing licenses had been issued to residents of that area. The supervisor concluded that Pitkin had made an error, likely recording a temporary logging or fishing camp as permanent residences. The 247 names were flagged as unverified in internal documents, but remained in the official 1960 census count. When the 1950 census records were declassified and made publicly available in 2002, a genealogist named Martha Callahan noticed the discrepancy. Callahan had been researching her family history on Orcas Island and obtained copies of census records dating back to 1900. She found that none of the 247 names from 1960 appeared in the 1950 census. They had not been on the island a decade earlier. Callahan contacted the Census Bureau to request clarification. A representative replied in a brief letter stating that the 1960 records for that area contained data entry errors and should not be relied upon for genealogical research. When Callahan pressed for details, she was told that no further documentation was available. Unsatisfied, Callahan visited the National Archives in Seattle and requested Gerald Pitkin's original field notes. She found them filed with the 1960 census materials for Washington State. Pitkin's handwriting was clear and consistent. His descriptions were detailed. On the page dated June 14th, he had drawn a rough map of the Eastern Shore, marking the locations of the 18 households. He noted the trail from Point Lawrence and described the community as well-established, perhaps 20 years or more. At the bottom of the page, Pitkin had written a single additional line, "Community not on county maps. Residents say they prefer isolation." Callahan shared her findings with a local historian, Benjamin Hoole, who had written extensively about the settlement patterns of the San Juan Islands. Hoole was familiar with temporary fishing camps and logging operations from the mid-20th century. He told Callahan that 247 people was far too large for a seasonal camp. That was a permanent settlement, families, children, infrastructure. Hoole obtained historical aerial photographs of Orcas Island from the Washington State Archives. Photographs taken in 1958 showed the Eastern Shore as unbroken forest. Photographs from 1962 showed the same. No clearings, no structures, no signs of human activity. In 2003, Callahan and Hoole hiked the Eastern Shore trails, following Pitkin's map as closely as they could interpret it. They found no foundations, no remnants of docks, no cleared land. The forest was old growth, in places undisturbed for centuries. Where Pitkin had marked households, they found only dense undergrowth and moss-covered stone. Hoole interviewed longtime residents of Orcas Island, people who had lived there since the 1950s. None remembered a fishing community on the Eastern Shore. A retired fisherman named Leonard Takahashi, whose family had operated a boat out of East Sound since the 1930s, said he had never seen any settlement there. "We fished those waters," he said. "If there'd been people, we'd have known." A former school teacher, Evelyn Marquardt, who had taught on the island from 1954 to 1978, reviewed the list of surnames from the census. She recognized none of them. "I taught every child on this island during those years," she said. "I would have remembered families with those names." In 2004, Callahan filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the Census Bureau, asking for any internal communications related to the 1960 Orcas Island count. The request was denied. The Bureau cited privacy protections and stated that field notes and internal correspondence from that period had been destroyed per standard retention policies. Houle contacted the San Juan County Assessor's Office and requested property records for the eastern shore of Orcas Island dating back to 1900. The records showed no private ownership in the areas Pitkin had marked. The land had been held by the state or federal government continuously with no sales, leases, or permits issued for residential use. Callahan attempted to locate Gerald Pitkin. Census Bureau employment records confirmed he had worked as an enumerator in 1960, but provided no further information. Callahan found a death certificate for a Gerald Pitkin, who had died in Seattle in 1973. The certificate listed his occupation as retired civil servant, but gave no details about his work history. Pitkin's widow, Agnes, had moved to Arizona. Callahan tracked her down in 2005 and spoke with her by phone. Agnes was 84 years old and remembered her husband's work with the census only vaguely. When Callahan asked specifically about the Eastern Shore community, Agnes paused for a long time. "He mentioned that once," she said. "He came home from that job and said he'd found a place that shouldn't have been there. I asked him what he meant, and he said the people were kind but strange. They didn't want to talk about where they'd come from or how long they'd been there. He said it felt like walking into the past." Agnes added that her husband had been troubled by something during that summer. He had tried to return to the Eastern Shore in July, after completing his census work, but could not find the trail again. He had walked for hours, she said, and came back frustrated and confused. He never spoke about it after that. In 2007, a documentary filmmaker named Rebecca Lindstrom traveled to Orcas Island to investigate the story. She interviewed Callahan, Houle, and several longtime residents. She hiked the eastern shore with a GPS unit, marking the locations Pitkin had described. She found nothing. Lindstrom also obtained a copy of the 1960 census records and verified the 247 names. She cross-referenced them with Social Security records, military records, and newspaper archives. None of the names appeared anywhere else in Washington state. None matched birth or death certificates from that period. It was as if the people had existed only for the brief moment Pitkin encountered them. Lindstrom's documentary aired once on a regional public television station in 2008. It received little attention. The Census Bureau declined to participate in the film. In 2010, the National Archives quietly reclassified Gerald Pitkin's field notes as restricted access. Requests to view them now require special permission and a written justification. Callahan attempted to obtain access in 2011. Her request was denied without explanation. The eastern shore of Orcas Island remains undeveloped. Hikers occasionally walk the trails and kayakers paddle along the coast. The forest is quiet. The beaches are empty. There is no sign that 247 people were ever counted there. But in the official 1960 census records, they remain. 247 names, 18 households, a fishing community on the eastern bluffs, recorded once and never seen again. Martha Callahan still lives on Orcas Island. She keeps a copy of Pitkin's field notes in a folder on her desk. Sometimes, she says, she thinks about hiking the eastern shore again just to see if anything has changed, but she hasn't gone back. There's a difference, she said in a 2012 interview, between a place that was abandoned and a place that was never meant to be found again. Mail arrives everywhere, even to addresses that don't exist. Shaw Island is the smallest of the 4 ferry-served San Juan Islands, a quiet patch of forested land barely 8 square miles in size. Its population has never exceeded 300. There is no town center, no commercial district, just scattered homes along narrow roads, a small schoolhouse, and a general store that doubles as the island's post office. For decades, the post office was run by Franciscan nuns from Our Lady of the Rock Monastery, women who took their postal duties as seriously as their prayers. The island's isolation is its defining feature. Ferry service is infrequent. Visitors are few. Most residents prefer it that way. People who chose Shaw Island did so because they wanted distance from the mainland and even from the busier neighboring islands. The community is tight-knit, protective of its rhythms and routines. Everyone knows everyone. Strangers are noticed, which made the packages all the more unusual. The first package arrived on March 7, 1978. Sister Magdalene Kowalski was working the counter when the mail ferry arrived with the afternoon delivery. Among the usual letters and parcels was a box roughly 8 inches square, wrapped in brown paper and bound with twine. The address label was typewritten, The Watch, P.O. Box 217, Shaw Island, WA 98286. There was no P.O. Box 217 on Shaw Island. The post office had only 73 active boxes at the time, numbered sequentially with no gaps. Sister Magdalene checked the registry twice. She examined the package for a return address. There was none. The postmark showed Seattle, dated 2 days prior. Postal regulations required packages addressed to non-existent boxes to be held for 10 days before being returned to sender, if a sender could be identified. Sister Magdalene placed the box in the holding area and made a note in the daily log. The package was cold. She noticed it when she lifted it from the sorting bin. Not freezing, but noticeably colder than the ambient temperature, as though it had been stored in a refrigerator. She assumed it contained something perishable and made a second note to check it the following day. The next morning, the package was still cold. Sister Magdalene opened the holding area and touched it again. The same temperature. She shook it gently. No sound, no shifting weight. Whatever was inside was packed tightly. On March 14th, exactly 1 week later, another package arrived. Same size, same brown paper and twine, same typed label. The Watch, P.O. Box 217, Shaw Island, WA 98286. Same Seattle postmark, and the same cold temperature. Sister Magdalene consulted with Sister Ruth Yamada, the postmaster and senior member of the monastery. Sister Ruth examined both packages and agreed they should be opened under postal inspection, given the non-existent address and the unusual physical properties. Unclaimed mail was subject to inspection after 15 days, but the coldness suggested potential food spoilage or biological material that might require earlier intervention. On March 16th, Sister Ruth opened the first package in the presence of Sister Magdalene and a third nun, Sister Grace Alvarez. Inside was a sealed plastic bag. Inside the bag was sand, fine-grained, pale gray sand, approximately 3 pounds of it. Nothing else. No note, no label, no explanation. Sister Ruth poured a small amount onto a sheet of paper. The sand was unremarkable, slightly coarse with tiny shell fragments mixed in. It appeared to be common beach sand. But the package was still cold, and the sand itself felt cold to the touch. The second package, opened the same day, contained exactly the same thing. 3 pounds of pale gray sand in a sealed plastic bag. cold, uniform, inexplicable. Over the following months, packages continued to arrive. Every Tuesday, without fail, the mail ferry brought another box addressed to The Watch at P.O. Box 217. The pattern held through March, April, May, June, July, and into August. 24 packages in total, each identical in size, wrapping, and contents. Each cold, each filled with sand. Sister Ruth contacted the Seattle Postal District office in April. She explained the situation and requested guidance. A supervisor told her to document each package and hold them until further notice. The postal inspector assigned to the case, a man named Donald Petrakis, visited Shaw Island on May 3rd. Petrakis examined 5 of the unopened packages. He confirmed the temperature anomaly. Each package was measurably colder than room temperature, approximately 15 degrees Fahrenheit below ambient. He opened them and found sand in each. He took samples and had them sent to a laboratory for analysis. The lab report, received 3 weeks later, identified the sand as marine sediment with high silica content and trace amounts of calcium carbonate from crushed shells. The composition was consistent with beach sand from the Pacific Northwest coast, but the lab could not pinpoint a specific source. There were no contaminants, no organic material, and no obvious reason for the sand to retain cold temperature. Petrakis noted in his report that the packages showed no signs of refrigeration, no gel packs, no dry ice residue, yet they remained cold for days after arrival. He recommended continued monitoring and retention of all future packages. Sister Ruth spoke to the other nuns and to several longtime island residents. No one recognized the name The Watch. No one had ordered anything that might explain the deliveries. The phrase meant nothing to anyone on the island. In June, Sister Magdalene took one of the sand samples and examined it under a magnifying glass. She noticed something unusual. In dim light, the sand seemed to have a faint glow. She turned off the lights in the post office storage room and looked again. The sand glowed softly, barely perceptible, like the face of a luminous watch in darkness. She mentioned this to Sister Ruth, who confirmed the observation. They contacted Petrakis again. He returned to Shaw Island on June 28th with a portable ultraviolet lamp. Under UV light, the sand glowed brightly, blue-green phosphorescence, vivid and unmistakable. Petrakis sent new samples to the University of Washington Geology Department with a request for identification of the phosphorescent material. The response came in late July. The sand contained trace amounts of dinoflagellates, microscopic organisms known for bioluminescence, but in concentrations far higher than typically found in beach sediment. The geologist noted that the distribution was unusually uniform and suggested the sand might have been collected from a specific location during a bioluminescent bloom. They could not, however, identify where in the Pacific Northwest such sand might have originated. Bioluminescent beaches were rare and typically associated with tropical or subtropical waters. No location in Washington, Oregon, or British Columbia matched the profile. The delivery stopped in August. The last package arrived on August 15, 1978. After that, nothing. No more boxes addressed to The Watch. No explanation. No follow-up. Petrakis filed a final report in September, noting that the case remained open but inactive. The Postal Inspection Service classified it as unresolved mail fraud or misdirection and retained the packages as evidence. The Seattle District Office suggested the sender had been engaged in some form of prank or art project and had lost interest. Sister Ruth kept copies of all documentation in the post office records. She mentioned the case occasionally to visitors or ferry workers, but most dismissed it as a curiosity. By 1980, the story had faded from conversation. In 1993, the Franciscan nuns sold the general store and a post office to a private operator. The monastery closed shortly afterward. Sister Ruth, by then retired and living in Seattle, donated the old post office records to the San Juan Historical Museum. The files related to the watch packages were archived but never cataloged. In 2006, a graduate student in folklore studies named Kevin Drabeck was researching postal anomalies for his thesis. He came across the Shaw Island case in the museum's uncatalogued materials and contacted the Postal Inspection Service for more information. He was told that the case file had been destroyed, per standard retention policies, and that no physical evidence remained. Drabeck tracked down Donald Petrakis, who had retired in 1998. Petrakis remembered the case clearly. He told Drabeck that the cold packages had bothered him more than any other case in his career. "I've seen a lot of strange mail," Petrakis said, "but I've never seen anything that stayed cold like that, with no explanation. It was like the sand itself didn't want to warm up." When asked if he had any theories, Petrakis shook his head. "I think someone was sending a message," he said, "but I don't think it was meant for anyone on Shaw Island." Drabeck visited Shaw Island in 2007 and spoke with a few longtime residents who remembered the packages. Most recalled them as odd but harmless. One elderly woman, Margaret Tolliver, who had lived on the island since the 1960s, said she had always found the story unsettling. "The nuns didn't scare easily," she said. "But I remember Sister Ruth saying once that whoever sent those packages knew exactly what they were doing. She said it felt deliberate, planned, like someone was keeping time." Drabeck's thesis included a chapter on the Shaw Island packages, but his work was never published beyond academic circles. He moved on to other research and lost touch with the story. The sand samples from the original investigation are gone. The packages were destroyed. The laboratory reports are archived but require special permission to access. The Seattle postmark provided no useful leads. Bulk mail from that era was not tracked with the precision of modern systems. Shaw Island remains quiet. The post office still operates now with numbered boxes running only to 73. There is no P.O. Box 217. There never was. But on some evenings, when the ferry arrives late and the light is fading, workers sorting mail will sometimes pause and touch the packages in the holding bin, checking for temperature. It has become a habit, passed down without explanation, just in case something arrives that is colder than it should be. There are places where North refuses to hold still. Turn Point marks the northwestern tip of Stewart Island, the most remote of the inhabited San Juan Islands. The lighthouse there was built in 1936, a modest automated beacon perched on a rocky headland where Harrow Strait meets Boundary Pass. The waters are treacherous, strong currents, submerged rocks, fog that rolls in without warning. The light was meant to guide vessels through the narrow channel between American and Canadian waters, a corridor where mistakes cost lives. Stewart Island itself has never had more than a few dozen permanent residents. There is no ferry service, no power grid. Those who live there do so by choice, accessing the island by private boat or float plane. Turn Point sits at the end of a rough trail, more than 2 miles from the nearest home. The lighthouse was automated in 1974. No keeper has lived there since. The area is beautiful in its starkness. Wind-bent trees, exposed granite, the constant sound of waves against stone. Hikers visit occasionally. Kayakers camp on the beach. The Coast Guard inspects the light twice a year. It is, by most accounts, an unremarkable place except for one detail that emerged in the early 1990s and has never been explained. Compasses don't work there. The first documented report came from a sailboat captain named Gregory Fonseca in June 1992. Fonseca was an experienced sailor who had navigated the San Juans for over 20 years. He was approaching Turn Point in clear conditions, using both GPS and a handheld magnetic compass to verify his position. As he closed to within a quarter mile of the point, he noticed his compass needle had shifted. Instead of pointing north, it pointed northwest, roughly 17 degrees off true magnetic north. Fonseca assumed the compass had been damaged or exposed to a magnetic field. He checked it against a backup compass mounted on his boat's binnacle. The same deviation. Both instruments showed north as being 17 degrees west of where it should be. His GPS, however, showed his position and heading as accurate. The discrepancy only affected the magnetic compasses. He reported the incident to the Coast Guard station at Friday Harbor when he returned to port. A brief note was made in the marine hazard log, but no action was taken. Compass deviations near shorelines were not uncommon. Local geology, iron deposits, or even shipwrecks could cause temporary interference. But the deviation at turn point was neither temporary nor localized to Fonseca's boat. Over the next year, 4 more sailors reported the same anomaly. Each described compasses shifting 17 degrees west when within 200 yards of turn point light station. Each verified their GPS remained accurate. Each confirmed the deviation disappeared as soon as they moved beyond the 200-yard radius. In August 1993, the Coast Guard sent a team to Turn Point to investigate. Chief Petty Officer Sandra Korhonen led the inspection. She brought 3 calibrated compasses and a portable magnetometer. Standing at the base of the lighthouse, all 3 compasses deviated exactly 17 degrees west of magnetic north. The magnetometer detected no unusual magnetic field strength, no readings that would account for such a consistent, precise deviation. Korhonen walked the perimeter, taking measurements every 50 feet. The deviation appeared uniformly within a roughly circular area centered on the lighthouse, extending approximately 200 yards in all directions. Beyond that boundary, compasses returned to normal function. The edge of the anomaly was sharp. Step inside the zone, and the needle shifted. Step outside, and it corrected. She filed a report with the Coast Guard District Office in Seattle. The report noted the anomaly, confirmed its consistency, and recommended further geological survey. It also included a recommendation to update navigation charts with a warning about compass unreliability near turn point. The chart update was issued in November 1993. A small notation appeared on marine charts. Magnetic anomaly reported near turn point light. Verify position with GPS. In March 1994, Dr. Elena Ruiz, a geophysicist from the University of Washington, visited Turn Point with a team of graduate students. Ruiz specialized in magnetic anomalies and had investigated similar phenomena in volcanic regions and near iron ore deposits. She brought sensitive magnetometers, ground-penetrating radar, and geological survey equipment. Her team spent 3 days at Turn Point. They mapped the anomaly in detail, confirming the 200-yard radius and the 17-degree deviation. They drilled core samples from the bedrock, granite, and basalt typical of the San Juan Islands, with no unusual iron content. They used ground-penetrating radar to search for buried metal objects or geological formations that might create a localized magnetic field. They found nothing. Ruiz's preliminary report, submitted to the university in May 1994, stated that the anomaly could not be explained by any known geological or magnetic source. The bedrock composition was uniform. There were no underground structures, no metallic deposits, and no evidence of volcanic activity that could account for the deviation. She recommended additional study using more advanced equipment. The university declined to fund further research. The anomaly, while unusual, posed no immediate safety risk. Sailors had GPS, and the Coast Guard had issued warnings. Ruiz moved on to other projects. Her report was filed in the university library, but not published in any peer-reviewed journal. Word of the compass anomaly spread through the sailing community. Some sailors made deliberate trips to Turnpoint to test it themselves. Online forums and regional boating magazines discussed the phenomenon. Most treated it as a curiosity, a quirk of local geology that science would eventually explain. But a few people noticed something else. In 1996, a retired Navy navigator named Arthur Delgado visited Turnpoint as part of a personal survey of magnetic anomalies in the Pacific Northwest. Delgado had worked with navigation systems for 30 years and had encountered numerous compass deviations caused by everything from submarines to underground cables. He brought precision instruments and spent 2 days documenting the Turnpoint anomaly. What troubled him, he later wrote in a letter to Dr. Ruiz, was not the deviation itself, but its precision. Magnetic anomalies are never this consistent, he wrote. They fluctuate with temperature, time of day, solar activity. But Turnpoint doesn't fluctuate. It's exactly 17 degrees every time, in every condition. That's not how natural magnetic fields behave. Delgado also noted that 17 degrees was a significant number in navigation. Close to the magnetic declination used in many parts of the Pacific Northwest during the early 20th century. He suggested, without elaborating, that the anomaly might be artificial in origin. Ruiz responded briefly, thanking him for the observation, but stating she had no evidence to support an artificial cause. She noted that no equipment or infrastructure at Turnpoint could produce such an effect, and ground-penetrating radar had ruled out buried objects. In 2001, the Coast Guard replaced the aging lighthouse equipment at Turnpoint with modern automated systems. Technicians installing the new beacon reported the compass deviation and requested guidance. A senior engineer reviewed the 1993 report and the marine chart notation. His recommendation was to rely on GPS for positioning and to treat the anomaly as a permanent local condition requiring no corrective action. The installation crew, however, noticed something additional. One technician, Michael Garvey, mentioned in his work log that his digital compass, a device that used electronic sensors rather than a magnetic needle, also showed the 17-degree deviation when in standalone mode. GPS-integrated compasses remained accurate, but pure magnetic sensors, whether analog or digital, all showed the same shift. Garvey's observation was noted, but not investigated. The Coast Guard's position was that sailors should use GPS, and the anomaly posed no navigational hazard to properly equipped vessels. In 2007, a documentary crew filming a series on Pacific Northwest lighthouses visited Turnpoint. They brought multiple compasses and tested the anomaly on camera. The footage clearly showed the needles shifting as they approached the lighthouse. The segment aired on a regional cable channel and generated brief interest, but no new investigations followed. Dr. Ruiz, by then a tenured professor, was contacted by journalists occasionally about Turnpoint. She always gave the same answer. The anomaly was real, measurable, and unexplained. She no longer speculated about causes. In 2013, a sailor named Patricia Okafor anchored near Turnpoint and hiked to the lighthouse. She brought a vintage brass compass that had belonged to her grandfather, a merchant marine captain. The compass had been manufactured in 1942 and had guided ships across the Atlantic during World War II. It had never failed. At Turnpoint, it deviated 17 degrees west. Okafor stood at the base of the lighthouse and watched the needle. She rotated slowly, checking the deviation from every direction. It remained constant. She stepped outside the 200-yard radius. The needle corrected immediately. She later described the experience in a blog post as unsettling, like the Earth itself was insisting that north was somewhere else, and no amount of arguing would change its mind. Turnpoint Light Station still operates. The beacon flashes every 10 seconds, visible for 14 miles on clear nights. Hikers still walk the trail. Kayakers still camp on the beach. The Coast Guard still inspects the light twice a year, and every compass within 200 yards still points 17 degrees west of magnetic north. The deviation has not changed in over 30 years. It does not fluctuate. It does not fade. Geologists have offered no explanation. Magnetic surveys have found no cause. The Navy, when asked, stated they had no installations or equipment in the area that could produce such an effect. In 2019, a graduate student in geophysics accessed Dr. Ruiz's archived report and attempted to replicate her measurements using modern equipment. The anomaly remained 17 degrees, 200 yards, precise and unchanging. The student noted in his thesis that the consistency suggested either an undiscovered natural phenomenon or something deliberately placed. He did not elaborate on what that something might be. Stewart Island remains remote. Turn Point remains isolated. And sailors approaching the point still check their compasses, watching as the needles swing west, defying north with a precision that feels less like nature and more like instruction, as if something beneath the rock is teaching every compass the same wrong direction. Time is supposed to be constant, but some nights it forgets to move forward. Lopez Island is the third largest of the San Juan Islands, known locally as the Friendly Isle, for the habit residents have of waving to passing cars. The island's population hovers around 2,000, most living in or near Lopez Village, a quiet cluster of shops, a library, a post office, and homes scattered along the south shore. It is the kind of place where everyone knows their neighbors, where ferry schedules dictate the rhythm of daily life, and where mechanical clocks are still common in older homes. The island has always been quiet. Its farmland was cleared by homesteaders in the late 1800s, and the pace of life has changed little since. There are no stoplights, no chain stores, no nightlife beyond the occasional community gathering. People who live on Lopez choose it for the stillness, for mornings where the loudest sound is the call of crows in the fir trees or the distant horn of the ferry arriving at Audlin. It is not a place where inexplicable things happen. Until March 14, 2003, when something did. The event occurred during the early morning hours, between 3:47 and 4:47 a.m. Most residents were asleep. The night was calm, no storms, no unusual weather. The power grid operated normally. There were no reports of seismic activity, no celestial events, no obvious disruptions to explain what happened next. At approximately 7:15 a.m., Margaret Lindgren woke in her home on the north edge of Lopez Village. She glanced at the wind-up alarm clock on her nightstand, a gift from her late husband, a reliable German mechanism she had owned for 30 years. It read 3:47 a.m. The second hand was moving. The clock was running. But the time was wrong by over 3 hours. Lindgren assumed the clock had stopped during the night and restarted on its own, though she had never known it to do so. She checked her digital watch on the dresser. It read 7:16 a.m. She wound the alarm clock forward to match and went downstairs to make coffee. At the post office that morning, clerk Raymond Takeda noticed the wall clock behind the counter showed the wrong time. The clock was mechanical, driven by a pendulum, and had hung in the same spot since the building opened in 1968. It read 3:47 a.m. Takeda checked his cell phone. The actual time was 8:32 a.m. He reset the wall clock manually and made a mental note to mention it to the postmaster. By mid-morning, conversations around the village revealed a pattern. Nearly everyone with a mechanical clock, wind-up alarms, pendulum wall clocks, antique mantelpieces reported the same thing. The clocks had stopped at 3:47 a.m. and restarted, but they were now running 1 hour slow. Digital clocks, battery-operated devices, and cell phones showed the correct time. Only mechanical clocks were affected. At the Lopez Island Library, Director Susan Reyes fielded questions from confused patrons. Several elderly residents brought in their clocks thinking they were broken. Reyes checked the library's own antique wall clock, a pendulum model donated in 1979. It also showed 3:47 a.m. when she had opened at 9. She had reset it without thinking much of it, but now, hearing the reports, she began to wonder. By afternoon, word had spread across the island. A quick survey revealed that at least 43 households in Lopez Village had experienced the same phenomenon. Every mechanical clock had stopped at exactly 3:47 a.m., and every mechanical clock, when examined, had restarted on its own, not at the correct time but 1 hour behind, as though the clocks themselves had skipped forward through an hour that did not exist for them. Martin Curry, a retired engineer who lived near the village center, became the informal investigator of the incident. Curry had worked in electrical engineering for 30 years and was trained to troubleshoot anomalies. He visited a dozen homes over the next 2 days, examining clocks and interviewing their owners. His findings were consistent. Every mechanical timepiece, whether spring-driven, weight-driven, or pendulum-operated, had stopped at 3:47 a.m. on March 14th. None of the owners had heard the clock stop. None had noticed anything unusual during the night. And all of the clocks had resumed running at what should have been 4:47 a.m., but their internal time remained frozen at 3:47 a.m. Curry tested one clock himself, a wind-up pocket watch owned by a neighbor, Douglas Finnegan. The watch had stopped at 3:47 and restarted an hour later. Curry opened the mechanism. It showed no damage, no wear, no mechanical failure. The gears were intact. The spring held tension. The watch should not have stopped unless deliberately halted or unless it had run out of wind. But Finnegan had wound it the evening before, as he did every night, and it had been fully operational. Curry compiled a list of affected clocks and their locations. The phenomenon appeared limited to Lopez Village and the immediate surrounding area, a radius of roughly 2 miles. Residents on the northern and western parts of the island reported no issues. Digital devices everywhere functioned normally throughout the night. On March 17th, Curry contacted the San Juan County Sheriff's Office and filed a formal report. Deputy Lauren Kasai took the information and forwarded it to her supervisor, who suggested the incident might be related to a power surge or electromagnetic pulse. Kasai pointed out that power surges would affect electronic devices, not mechanical clocks. The supervisor had no other explanation. Kasai visited Curry on March 19th and reviewed his findings. She confirmed the pattern but could offer no investigative resources. The county had no expertise in unexplained temporal anomalies, and no crime had been committed. She filed the report as unusual incident, no suspect, no property damage, and closed the case. In April, Curry sent a detailed letter to the University of Washington Physics Department describing the event and requesting analysis. He included timestamps, witness statements, and photographs of several affected clocks. He received a polite reply from a graduate assistant stating that the department did not investigate anecdotal phenomena without reproducible data. The assistant suggested Curry contact a horologist, a clock repair specialist, to check for mechanical defects. Curry brought 3 of the affected clocks to a horologist in Seattle, a man named Victor Albrecht, who had restored antique timepieces for 40 years. Albrecht examined each clock carefully. He found no defects. The mechanisms were sound. When asked if he could explain why all 3 had stopped at the same time, Albrecht said he could not. "Clocks don't synchronize like that," Albrecht told Curry. "Each mechanism has its own tolerances, its own friction, its own rate of wear. For 3 clocks to stop at the exact same second, you'd need an external force, something that affected all of them simultaneously. But I don't know what that force would be." In May 2003, a journalist from the San Juan Islander, the local weekly newspaper, wrote a brief article about the incident. The piece ran under the headline, "Village Clocks Stop in Unison. Cause Unknown." It summarized the reports and quoted Khoury and several residents. The article generated a few letters to the editor, but no follow-up investigation. One letter, from a retired Navy technician named Harold Vreeland, suggested the phenomenon might be related to a localized electromagnetic anomaly, possibly from military equipment or atmospheric conditions. Vreeland noted that mechanical clocks could be affected by strong magnetic fields, though he acknowledged that such fields would typically damage the mechanisms rather than pause them uniformly. Another letter from a resident who identified herself only as JP mentioned that her grandmother had told stories of similar events in rural Ireland during the early 1900s, clocks stopping at the same time across a village, then resuming as though nothing had happened. JP did not provide sources or dates, and the letter was not taken seriously. By summer, the incident had faded from conversation. Most residents had reset their clocks and moved on. The mechanisms continued to function normally. No further anomalies were reported. But Martin Khoury kept his notes. He maintained the list of affected clocks and their locations. And every year on March 14th, he stayed awake through the early morning hours, watching his own mechanical clock, a pendulum wall clock that had stopped at 3:47 a.m. in 2003. The clock has never stopped again. In 2011, a graduate student in anthropology at Western Washington University contacted Khoury while researching modern folklore and temporal anomalies. The student, Isabel Marquez, interviewed Khoury and several other Lopez residents. She included the Lopez Village incident in her thesis as an example of collective experience that defied conventional explanation. Marquez noted in her conclusion that the event had all the hallmarks of a localized temporal distortion, a brief disruption in the flow of time affecting only mechanical systems. She acknowledged that such a concept had no basis in accepted physics, but suggested it warranted further study. Her thesis was filed in the university library. It was not widely read. Lopez Village remains quiet. The clocks in homes and public buildings keep time as they always have. The post office clock still hangs behind the counter. Margaret Lindgren's wind-up alarm still sits on her nightstand, wound every evening, ticking through the night. And on some mornings, residents will glance at their clocks and feel a brief hesitation, a momentary uncertainty, wondering if the time they see is the time that actually passed, or if somewhere in the mechanics of springs and gears, an hour was skipped that no one will ever recover. Because in Lopez Village, on one night in March 2003, time moved forward for everything except the things designed to measure it. And no one has ever explained why. Some voices arrive long after the microphone stops listening. Rosario Resort sits on the eastern shore of Orcas Island, a sprawling estate built between 1906 and 1909 by Robert Moran, a self-made shipbuilder who had earned his fortune in Seattle before retiring to the San Juans. The mansion he constructed was one of the finest in the Pacific Northwest. 54 rooms, a music room with a 1900 pipe organ, mahogany paneling shipped from Honduras, and stained glass windows imported from Europe. Moran lived there until his death in 1943, and the estate eventually became a resort, preserving much of its original character. The mansion's history is well documented. Moran kept meticulous records of its construction and operation. Visitors came often, politicians, artists, business associates. Moran himself was an amateur musician and hosted concerts in the music room. The estate was a place of culture and refinement, isolated enough to offer privacy, but grand enough to impress. In 1936, a regional journalist named Theodore Bancroft conducted an interview with Moran for a feature story on Pacific Northwest industrialists. The interview took place in the library at Rosario, recorded on an early magnetic wire recorder, cutting-edge technology for the time. Bancroft asked about Moran's career, his shipbuilding innovations, and his decision to retire to Orcas Island. The interview lasted 42 minutes. Bancroft's article appeared in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer in May of that year. The original wire recording was donated to the Washington State Historical Society in 1978, along with Bancroft's notes and other materials from his journalism career. It sat in the archives, largely forgotten, until 2004, when the Society initiated a project to digitize and preserve fragile audio materials from the early 20th century. The work was assigned to Daniel Kapoor, a senior audio technician with 15 years of experience in archival restoration. Kapoor had worked on hundreds of recordings, oral histories, radio broadcasts, field recordings. He understood the medium. Magnetic wire was delicate, prone to degradation, but the Moran interview was in relatively good condition. Kapoor began the transfer process in June 2004. He played the wire through a specialized reader, capturing the audio digitally at high resolution. The interview came through clearly. Moran's voice, deep and measured, Bancroft's questions, the faint hum of the recording equipment. Nothing unusual. But when Kapoor applied noise reduction filters to clean the recording, he noticed something beneath the primary audio, a second layer of sound, faint, barely audible, but distinct once isolated. Two voices conversing in low tones. At first, Kapoor assumed it was bleed-through from another recording. Wire recorders could sometimes pick up stray electromagnetic signals or retain traces of previously recorded material if the wire had been reused. But the Moran wire had never been reused. Bancroft's notes indicated it was new stock, purchased specifically for the interview. Kapoor isolated the secondary audio and amplified it. The voices became clearer. Two men speaking English, but with an accent or cadence he didn't immediately recognize. The conversation was fragmented, overlapping with Moran and Bancroft's interview, but certain phrases emerged distinctly. The deep water site remains accessible. Schedule must be maintained through the winter months. No signs of disturbance from the northern approach. The voices were calm, matter-of-fact, as though discussing routine logistics. But they were not Moran or Bancroft. The tonal quality was different, and they should not have been on the recording at all. Kapoor documented the discovery and alerted his supervisor, Patricia Odom, the Society's head of archival collections. Odom listened to the isolated audio. She agreed it was anomalous, but suggested Kapoor continue the restoration and prepare a technical report. Over the next 2 weeks, Kapoor worked to extract as much of the secondary conversation as possible. He used spectral analysis, frequency filtering, and waveform editing to separate the voices from the primary interview. He recovered approximately 4 minutes of dialogue, scattered throughout the 42-minute recording. The fragments were never continuous. 3 seconds here, 8 seconds there, phrases that seemed to belong to a longer conversation that was only partially captured. The content was cryptic but consistent. References to a deep water site, mentions of schedules and winter access. A phrase about maintaining the markers. And near the end of the recording, one voice said something that Kapoor found particularly unsettling. "No one will hear this until we've finished." Kapoor submitted his report in July 2004. He included the restored audio files, spectral analyses, and a detailed technical assessment. His conclusion was cautious. The secondary voices were real, embedded in the original wire recording, but their source was unknown. He recommended further analysis by linguistic experts and possibly acoustic forensics. Odom forwarded the report to Dr. Helen Vargas, a linguist at the University of Washington, specializing in historical dialects and phonetics. Vargas listened to the isolated voices and spent 3 days analyzing their speech patterns, vowel pronunciations, and cadence. Her findings, submitted in a memo dated August 9, 2004, were unexpected. The English spoken by the secondary voices was, in her assessment, phonetically inconsistent with any modern American or Canadian dialect. The vowel shifts, the rhythm, and certain consonant pronunciations resembled patterns found in English, spoken in the late 1700s or early 1800s, before the standardization of American English as it exists today. Vargas noted that the effect was subtle. The speakers were not using archaic vocabulary or grammar. They sounded like native English speakers, but their accent reflected phonetic features that had largely disappeared by the mid-19th century. She wrote, "If I were to speculate, I would say these speakers learned English in an environment where older dialectical patterns had been preserved, possibly in an isolated community. But that does not explain how their voices appear on a 1936 recording." Odom consulted with audio forensic specialists at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, seeking an explanation for how the secondary voices could have been recorded. The FBI's response, received in October 2004, stated that magnetic wire recorders could not passively capture sound that was not physically present during the recording session. The technology lacked the sensitivity to pick up distant conversations or radio transmissions. If the voices were on the wire, they had to have been in the room when Bancroft recorded Moran, or the wire had been deliberately manipulated afterward. But Bancroft's notes made no mention of additional people in the room, and the wire showed no signs of splicing, overdubbing, or post-recording alteration. It was, by all technical measures, an original, unedited recording. In November 2004, Odom contacted Bancroft's surviving family. His daughter, Evelyn Bancroft Ruiz, was 87 years old and living in Olympia. She remembered her father's work and confirmed that he had conducted the Moran interview alone, just him, Moran, and the recording equipment. She had no explanation for the secondary voices and suggested her father's notes might contain additional context. Odom reviewed Bancroft's archived materials again. Among his papers was a brief handwritten entry dated June 19, 1936, 3 days after the Moran interview. It read, "Reviewed the Moran wire this morning. Heard something odd beneath the interview. Thought it might be interference from the estate's electrical systems. Will mention it to Moran next visit." There was no record of Bancroft returning to Rosario or following up on the anomaly. He died in 1968. The wire remained in his files untouched until it was donated a decade later. The Historical Society decided not to publicize the discovery. Odom issued an internal memo stating that the secondary audio was an artifact of unknown origin requiring further study, but that it did not compromise the historical value of the Moran interview itself. The restored recording was made available to researchers, but the secondary voices were not mentioned in the catalog description. In 2007, a graduate student in acoustic archaeology named Michael Tran requested access to the Moran recording as part of a thesis on early audio technology. He noticed the secondary voices immediately and asked Odom for background. She provided Kapoor's report and Vargas's linguistic analysis. Tran conducted his own investigation. He obtained architectural plans of the Rosario mansion and determined that the library, where the interview took place, was located on the second floor with no adjacent rooms that could have bled sound through walls. He reviewed weather records from June 1936, finding no unusual atmospheric conditions that might have caused radio interference. He also contacted the Rosario Resort directly and asked if any staff or guests had reported unusual audio phenomena in the mansion. The resort's manager, Laura Kimura, said there had been occasional reports over the years. guests hearing faint voices in empty rooms, particularly in the music room and library. The reports were infrequent and generally attributed to the building's age and acoustic properties. Tran's thesis, completed in 2008, included a chapter on the Moran recording. He concluded that the secondary voices were genuine artifacts embedded in the original wire, but that their origin could not be determined. He suggested three possibilities: a technological anomaly unique to early magnetic recording, unintentional capture of a conversation occurring elsewhere in time or space through unknown means, or deliberate hoaxing by an unknown party. He favored the first explanation, but admitted the evidence was inconclusive. The thesis was filed at the University of Washington Library. It received no significant attention. In 2012, Kapoor retired from the Historical Society. Before leaving, he made a personal copy of the Moran recording, including the isolated secondary voices. He kept it on a hard drive at his home in Tacoma. In an email to a colleague, he wrote, "I've worked on thousands of recordings. I've heard tape hiss, electromagnetic interference, crosstalk, every kind of artifact you can imagine, but I've never heard voices that shouldn't exist, and I don't think we ever will explain it." The original wire recording remains in the Washington State Historical Society archives. Researchers can request access, though few do. The secondary voices are still there, embedded in the magnetic pattern, repeating the same fragments whenever the wire is played. The deep water site remains accessible. Schedule must be maintained. No one will hear this until we've finished. Rosario Resort still operates. Guests stay in the mansion's renovated rooms. Weddings are held in the music room. The library, where Bancroft recorded Moran in 1936, is now a lounge, quiet and wood-paneled, with tall windows overlooking Cascade Bay. And sometimes, late at night, staff walking through the empty halls report hearing faint voices, too low to make out words, but distinct enough to stop and listen. No one records them anymore. There are depths where the ocean refuses to follow its own rules. Obstruction Pass is a narrow channel of water, separating the southeastern tip of Orcas Island from smaller Obstruction Island, a rocky outcrop barely inhabited and accessible only by private boat. The pass itself is less than a quarter-mile wide at its narrowest point, with depths ranging from 30 to 80 feet. Strong tidal currents sweep through twice daily, creating challenging conditions for navigation, but also making the area popular with experienced divers seeking dramatic underwater terrain. The pass takes its name from the navigational difficulty it once posed to early explorers: submerged rocks, shifting currents, and poor visibility during tidal exchanges made it a hazard for sailing vessels. Modern charts mark the hazards clearly, but the pass retains its reputation among local boaters as a place requiring caution and respect. The underwater landscape is typical of the San Juan Islands: rocky walls covered in anemones and sea stars, kelp forests swaying in the current, occasional sightings of octopus and lingcod. The pass is not particularly deep compared to surrounding channels, nor is it known for unusual marine life. It is, by most measures, an unremarkable dive site, except for one feature that has puzzled divers and marine scientists since at least the early 1990s. At exactly 47 feet below the surface, the water changes. The first documented observation came from a dive instructor named Caroline Reyes in August 1992. Reyes was leading a group of advanced students through Obstruction Pass, descending along the western wall. She was monitoring depth carefully, as was her practice, when she noticed an abrupt change in water temperature at 47 feet. The shift was dramatic. Her dive computer registered a 12-degree Fahrenheit increase over what she estimated to be less than a foot of vertical distance. Above the boundary, the water was 53 degrees, typical for late summer in the San Juans. Below it, the temperature jumped to 65 degrees. The change was so sudden that Reyes initially thought her equipment had malfunctioned. She signaled her students to hold position and ascended 2 feet. The temperature dropped back to 53 degrees. She descended again, crossing the boundary slowly. The warmth returned. She repeated the test 3 times, confirming the effect. Her students, each equipped with their own dive computers, reported the same readings. Reyes noted the phenomenon in her dive log, but attributed it to an unusually sharp thermocline, a layer where water of different temperatures meets. Thermoclines are common in lakes and oceans, typically forming where warm surface water sits above colder deep water. But obstruction pass was shallow, and the temperature inversion was backwards. Warm water below cold water defied normal stratification patterns. Over the following years, other divers reported the same experience. The boundary appeared consistently at 47 feet, regardless of season, tide, or surface conditions. And in winter, when surface temperatures dropped to 48 degrees, the water below 47 feet remained warmer. In summer, the differential persisted. The boundary never moved, it never weakened. And below the boundary, visibility collapsed. Divers who descended past 47 feet reported that the water became murky within a few additional feet of depth, even when conditions above the boundary were crystal clear. The murkiness was not caused by suspended sediment or plankton blooms. It was more like a uniform haze that reduced visibility to 5 feet or less. Lights penetrated poorly. The beam from a dive torch seemed to dissipate faster than it should. In June 1998, a marine biology graduate student named Trevor Okimoto conducted his thesis research on kelp forest ecology in the San Juan Islands. Obstruction Pass was one of his study sites. Okimoto dove there 16 times over 3 months, collecting data on kelp density and marine invertebrates. He became interested in the thermal boundary after experiencing it himself. On his 7th dive, he brought a handheld thermometer and a depth gauge, intending to document the phenomenon more precisely. His measurements confirmed what other divers had reported, a 12-degree temperature increase at 47 feet, occurring over a vertical distance of approximately 6 inches. Okimoto mentioned the anomaly to his thesis advisor, Dr. Nina Kowalski, an oceanographer at the University of Washington. Kowalski was skeptical, but intrigued. Thermoclines in shallow coastal waters were typically gradual, spanning several feet or more. A 6-inch transition with a 12-degree differential was highly unusual. In August 1998, Kowalski joined Okimoto on a dive in Obstruction Pass. She brought calibrated temperature sensors and a pressure gauge to verify depth. She descended slowly along the western wall, monitoring her instruments. At 47 feet, the temperature increase appeared exactly as Okimoto had described. Kowalski recorded the data and surfaced. Her initial hypothesis was that the boundary was caused by geothermal activity, possibly a hydrothermal vent or warm spring entering the pass from below. But sonar surveys of the pass conducted in previous years showed no vents or unusual geological features. The seafloor was rock and sediment, typical of the region, with no obvious heat sources. Kowalski submitted a brief report to the journal Marine Ecology Progress Series in October 1998, describing the thermal anomaly and proposing further study. The report was accepted but generated little response. A few colleagues expressed interest, but no funding was available for additional research. In 2001, a diving equipment company sponsored a technical dive expedition in Obstruction Pass, hoping to test new thermal monitoring gear. The team included 4 divers and a support boat equipped with sonar and underwater cameras. The expedition's goal was to map the thermal boundary in 3 dimensions and determine whether it extended across the entire width of the pass or was localized to specific areas. Over 2 days, the team conducted 8 dives. They confirmed the boundary existed at 47 feet along the western wall, the center of the channel, and the eastern wall near Obstruction Island. It appeared to span the full width of the pass, a horizontal plane of warmer water sitting beneath colder water, stable and unmoving. The team also documented the visibility reduction below the boundary. One diver, Marcus Johansson, descended to 60 feet with an underwater camera. He reported that visibility at that depth was less than 3 feet, even with high-intensity lights. His camera footage showed only gray murk, with occasional glimpses of rock surfaces when he was within arm's reach. Johansson also noted something else. The water below the boundary, he said, felt heavier, like swimming through something thicker than water. His dive computer showed normal pressure readings, but the sensation persisted throughout the dive. The expedition's findings were compiled into a technical report and shared with the diving community. The report noted the thermal anomaly, confirmed its consistency, and recommended caution for divers unfamiliar with the site. It did not offer an explanation for the phenomenon. In 2005, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration conducted a survey of Puget Sound and the San Juan Islands as part of a broader study on climate change and ocean temperature patterns. Obstruction Pass was included in the survey. NOAA deployed autonomous underwater vehicles equipped with temperature and salinity sensors. The vehicles recorded the thermal boundary at 47 feet. NOAA's oceanographers reviewed the data and concluded that the anomaly could not be explained by conventional oceanographic processes. Thermoclines of that sharpness required either a physical barrier, like a dense layer of fresh water sitting on salt water, or an external heat source. Neither condition existed in Obstruction Pass. A NOAA scientist, Dr. Samuel Otieno, suggested in an internal memo that the boundary might be maintained by localized geothermal heating or by an unusually stable circulation pattern that prevented mixing. He recommended further investigation, but noted that the site's small size and limited navigational significance made it a low priority for federal research funding. The memo was filed. No further investigation occurred. In 2009, a recreational diver named Angela Durand visited Obstruction Pass and descended to 55 feet, deliberately crossing the thermal boundary. She later described the experience in an online dive forum as unsettling in a way I can't quite explain. She wrote that the water below 47 feet felt wrong, not dangerous, but like you've crossed into a space that wasn't meant for people. Durand's post generated discussion among other divers who had experienced the boundary. Several echoed her sentiment. One diver, posting under the username Salish Diver, wrote, "I've dove all over the world and I've never felt anything like that. It's not cold, it's not dark, it's just off, like the water below that line doesn't want you there." In 2012, Trevor Okimoto, who had completed his doctorate and become a marine ecologist, returned to Obstruction Pass with updated equipment. He wanted to revisit the thermal boundary using modern sensors. Over 3 dives, he confirmed the anomaly remained unchanged. The boundary was still at 47 feet. The temperature differential was still 12 degrees. The visibility below was still poor. Okamoto also collected water samples from above and below the boundary. Laboratory analysis showed no significant difference in salinity, dissolved oxygen, or chemical composition. The water was, by measurable standards, identical, yet it behaved differently. In 2015, Okimoto published a paper in the Journal of Marine Systems titled Persistent Thermal Stratification in Obstruction Pass, an Unexplained Coastal Anomaly. The paper summarized 15 years of observations and data. It concluded that the thermal boundary could not be explained by known oceanographic mechanisms, and recommended interdisciplinary study involving geologists, physicists, and oceanographers. The paper was peer-reviewed and accepted. It was cited in a few subsequent studies on unusual marine phenomena, but generated no follow-up research. Funding priorities lay elsewhere. Obstruction Pass remains a popular dive site. Instructors still take students there. Recreational divers still explore the kelp forests and rocky walls. And nearly everyone who dives below 47 feet encounters the boundary, the sudden warmth, the collapsing visibility, the sense that something about the water has changed. Most divers ascend after a brief look. A few continue deeper, into the murk, where the seafloor is barely visible even at arm's length. They report nothing unusual, just rock, sand, and the occasional fish. But they also report the feeling Marcus Johansson described years earlier, that the water down there is heavier, denser, as though it resists movement in ways water should not. Trevor Okimoto still dives Obstruction Pass when he visits the San Juans. He has descended past the boundary more than 50 times. In a conversation with a colleague in 2018, he said, "I've measured it, I've sampled it, I've documented it, and I still don't know what it is. The ocean doesn't work this way, but it does there. And I don't think we're going to figure out why." The boundary remains 47 feet, 12 degrees warmer, always. And below it, in the haze where visibility fails and the water feels wrong, something keeps the warmth from rising and the cold from falling, as if the ocean in that one small place has learned to hold its breath. Some messages are carved by hands that left no other trace. Decatur Island is one of the smallest inhabited islands in the San Juan archipelago, barely 3 square miles of forested hills and rocky shoreline. Its population has never exceeded 100. There is no ferry service, no commercial development, no public infrastructure beyond a small airstrip used occasionally by private planes. Those who live on Decatur do so deliberately, seeking isolation and the kind of quiet that comes only from being surrounded by cold water and distance. The northern shore is particularly remote, a stretch of cobbled beach accessible only by boat or a rough trail through dense timber. The beach faces Rosario Strait, where strong currents sweep past twice daily, carrying driftwood, kelp, and the occasional piece of marine debris. The stones there are smooth and gray, rounded by centuries of wave action. They range in size from pebbles to boulders, scattered along a half-mile curve of shoreline that sees few visitors even in summer. It is a place that should be predictable. Tides come and go, storms rearrange the beach. Nothing changes that shouldn't. Until 1998, when someone or something began leaving letters. The first carved stone was found by Diane Hutchins on April 7, 1998. Hutchins was a nature photographer who had moved to Decatur Island in 1996, seeking subject matter away from tourist-heavy locations. She walked the northern beach most mornings, documenting seasonal changes in light and landscape. That morning, she noticed a stone near the high tide line that caught her eye. It was roughly the size of a grapefruit, pale gray granite, worn smooth. Carved into its surface was a single lowercase letter, W. The letter was serif, small decorative strokes at the ends of the lines, and deeply incised, as though cut with a chisel or rotary tool. The carving was weathered, the edges softened, as if it had been exposed to the elements for years. Hutchins photographed the stone and continued her walk. She assumed it was a piece of folk art, perhaps left by another beachcomber. The island had a small community of artists and craftspeople. Someone might have carved it as a meditation on language or impermanence. 3 days later, she found another stone. Same beach, 50 yards farther east. This one bore the letter M. Same lowercase serif style. Same weathered appearance. Hutchins photographed it and placed both stones side by side for comparison. The carving technique appeared identical, same depth, same serif details, same aging. Over the next 6 months, Hutchins found 11 more carved stones. Each bore a single lowercase letter. The letters appeared at irregular intervals, sometimes days apart, sometimes weeks. They were always found near the high tide line, as though deposited by the previous night's tide. And they were always weathered, showing none of the fresh cuts or bright stone, surfaces that would indicate recent carving. Hutchins began documenting the finds systematically. She photographed each stone in place, then collected them and stored them at her cabin. She noted the date, location, and tide conditions for each discovery. By October 1998, she had 13 stones with the following letters: W, M, O, S, J, K, L, N, W, M, R, O, S. The letters spelled nothing coherent. Some repeated W, M, O, and S. Each appeared twice. Hutchins tried anagramming them, looking for hidden words or patterns. She found none. The letters seemed random, though the fact that certain combinations repeated suggested they might be part of a larger set. In November 1998, Hutchins mentioned the stones to a neighbor, retired geologist Victor Albrecht. Albrecht examined the stones and confirmed they were local granite, consistent with the geology of the San Juan Islands. The carvings, he noted, showed weathering patterns typical of long exposure to saltwater and freeze-thaw cycles. He estimated the carvings were at least several decades old, possibly much older. When Hutchins pointed out that she had found the stones over a 6-month period, Albrecht paused. He looked at the stones again. "If you're telling me these appeared recently," he said, "then someone is artificially aging them. You can accelerate weathering with chemicals or abrasion, but I can't tell the difference just by looking." Hutchins continued her morning walks. The stones continued to appear. By the end of 1999, she had collected 28. In 2000, she found 9 more. The pattern held: single lowercase serif letters, weathered appearance, irregular intervals. In 2001, Hutchins contacted the Washington State Office of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. She sent photographs and a written description of the finds. A field archaeologist named Laura Fenwick responded with interest and visited Decatur Island in June 2001. Fenwick examined 5 of the stones under magnification. She noted the serif style, which she identified as similar to typefaces used in print from the late 19th to mid-20th century. The weathering was consistent with prolonged environmental exposure. She could find no evidence of artificial aging, no chemical residues, no tool marks indicative of recent work. Fenwick asked Hutchins to show her the beach where the stones had been found. They walked the northern shore together. Hutchins pointed out the general area, a 200-yard stretch where most of the stones had appeared. Fenwick examined the beach, looking for signs of recent carving activity, stone chips, tool marks on larger rocks, anything that might indicate someone was working there. She found nothing. Fenwick's report, filed with the state in July 2001, noted the anomaly but offered no conclusions. She wrote, "The carvings are genuine and weathered. If they are appearing as recently as the witness claims, then either they are being carved elsewhere and deposited on the beach, or they are much older and being moved from some unknown source by natural processes. The location and condition of the beach make both scenarios unlikely, but not impossible." The report recommended no further action. The stones were not archaeologically significant. They bore no datable inscriptions, no cultural markers, nothing that tied them to a specific period or people. They were curious but not urgent. Hutchins continued collecting. By 2002, she had 40 stones. By 2003, 43. The letters still made no sense. Sequences like WMR, OSJ, and KLN appeared multiple times, but no coherent words or phrases emerged. Other residents of Decatur Island began noticing the stones as well. A retired schoolteacher named Margaret Tolliver found 2 on her own morning walk in August 2002. Both bore the letter K. She gave them to Hutchins, who added them to the collection. A kayaker passing the northern shore in September 2003 reported seeing a rock with a letter carved on it, but did not retrieve it. By the time Hutchins walked the beach the next day, no such stone was visible. She wondered how many had appeared and washed away before she could find them. In 2004, Hutchins stopped finding the stones. Her last discovery was on March 19th, a stone bearing the letter N. After that, nothing. She continued her morning walks through the spring and summer, checking the high tide line, searching for new carvings. None appeared. By 2005, she accepted that the phenomenon, whatever it had been, was over. She had 43 stones collected over 6 years and no explanation for their origin. In 2007, a journalist from the Seattle Times visited Decatur Island to write a feature on island life. Hutchins mentioned the stones in passing. The journalist, intrigued, wrote a brief sidebar about the mystery. The article ran on August 12, 2007, under the headline, "Carved Stones Appear, Then Vanish on Remote Island Beach." The article generated a few letters to the editor. One reader suggested the stones were left by a beachcombing artist who had since moved away. Another proposed they were remnants of an old signage system used by fishermen or smugglers. A geologist wrote in to note that carved stones could travel long distances in ocean currents and that the carvings might predate their arrival on Decatur Island by decades. None of the theories explained why the stones had appeared consistently for 6 years and then stopped, or why they all showed the same weathering, the same serif style, the same inexplicable precision. In 2009, Hutchins donated the 43 stones to the San Juan Historical Museum. The museum cataloged them as carved beach stones, origin unknown, collected Decatur Island, 1998 to 2004. They were placed in storage. Few visitors knew they existed. Victor Albrecht, the geologist, examined them one final time before the donation. He brought a colleague from the University of Washington, a specialist in rock weathering named Dr. Samuel Orendane. Together, they studied the stones under laboratory conditions, using microscopy and chemical analysis to assess the age of the carvings. Their findings, shared informally with Hutchins, but never published, were unsettling. The weathering patterns were consistent with exposure to a marine environment for 50 to 100 years. The tool marks, faint but visible under magnification, suggested hand carving with metal chisels, techniques common in the late 1800s and early 1900s. But the stones had appeared between 1998 and 2004. Orendane told Hutchins that either the stones had been carved long ago and stored somewhere protected until recently, or the weathering had been artificially accelerated in a way he could not detect. He favored the first explanation, but admitted he had no idea where such a cache might have been, or why someone would release the stones one at a time over 6 years. Albrecht offered a different thought. "Maybe they've always been here," he said, "buried in the beach, under sand or gravel. And something, tides, storms, shifting sediment, has been exposing them one by one." Hutchins asked if that would explain why they stopped appearing. Albrecht shrugged. "Maybe you found them all, or maybe whatever was uncovering them stopped." Diane Hutchins still lives on Decatur Island. She still walks the northern beach most mornings, though less frequently now. She has not found another carved stone since 2004. But she keeps a photograph on her wall, a grid of all 43 stones arranged in the order she found them. She looks at it sometimes, tracing the letters with her eyes, searching for patterns that never emerge. And on quiet mornings, when the tide is low and the beach is empty, she wonders if there are more stones still out there, buried under sand, waiting in the current, or being carved somewhere she cannot see by hands that learned their serif typeface more than a century ago. The letters say nothing, but they were written for someone, and whoever that was, they knew where to leave the message. There are moments when a town speaks with one voice and no one knows who gave the signal. Friday Harbor sits on the eastern shore of San Juan Island, the commercial and administrative center of the San Juan archipelago. The town has served as the county seat since 1873, a small grid of streets rising from the ferry terminal where boats arrive daily from the mainland. The harbor itself is sheltered and deep, ringed by docks where fishing boats, pleasure craft, and the occasional Coast Guard cutter tie up alongside commercial vessels. The town is compact, fewer than 3,000 residents year-round, though summer tourists swell that number considerably. There are 3 church steeples visible from the waterfront: the Methodist Church built in 1892, the Catholic Church from 1928, and a Congregationalist chapel dating to 1908. A clock tower stands above the county courthouse, installed in 1936. The ferry terminal has a foghorn. Several ships in the harbor carry their own horns and bells, used for signaling and navigation. None of these systems are connected. Each operates independently. Mechanical clocks, manual bells, compressed air horns activated by human hand or automated timer. There is no central control, no shared signal, no reason they should ever sound together unless coordinated deliberately by multiple people acting in precise unison. On July 19, 1985, at exactly 11:03 a.m., they all sounded at once. The event lasted 7 seconds. Every clock tower chime, every church bell, every ship horn in Friday Harbor activated simultaneously. The sound was immense but strangely coherent. Not a cacophony, but a layered chord where individual sources remained distinct, yet harmonized into something singular. Margaret Lindstrom, a librarian at the San Juan Island Library, was shelving books when it happened. She stopped mid-reach, startled by the sound. It was loud enough to penetrate the building's thick walls, but what struck her most was the precision. It wasn't like someone had set off all the alarms at once, she later told a reporter. It was like they'd been waiting to sound together, like they'd been holding their breath and finally let it out. Richard Kowalski, a commercial fisherman preparing his boat at the dock, heard it differently. Every horn, every bell. It hit at the same instant, not close, exact. And it wasn't chaos. It was one sound made of many sounds. I've been on the water 30 years. I know what ships sound like. That wasn't normal. At the county courthouse, Clerk Susan Yamada checked the clock tower mechanism. It was a mechanical system, wound weekly, that struck the hours and half hours. It should not have chimed at 11:03. Yamada inspected the gears and weights. Everything appeared normal. The clock showed the correct time. There was no malfunction she could identify. At the Methodist Church, Reverend Thomas Bergstrom checked the bell tower. The bell was rung manually by pulling a rope, and the rope hung undisturbed. No one had been in the tower that morning. Yet he and 24 parishioners gathered for a planning meeting had heard the bell ring, clear, sustained, unmistakable. At the ferry terminal, Harbor Master Douglas Alvarez reviewed the foghorn log. The horn had not been activated. The control was manual, requiring a button press in the terminal office. No one had pressed it. Yet passengers waiting for the 11:15 ferry to Anacortes reported hearing the horn sound, along with everything else. By mid-afternoon, word had spread through the town. People compared notes. The consensus was clear. At 11:03 a.m., every bell, horn, and chime in Friday Harbor had sounded together. The duration matched across all accounts, roughly 7 seconds, and no one had an explanation. The San Juan County Sheriff's Office received 3 formal reports on July 20th. Deputy Lauren Kasai investigated. She interviewed witnesses, checked the clock tower, visited the churches, and spoke with the harbor master. Her report, filed on July 22nd, noted the event, but concluded there was no evidence of tampering, mechanical failure, or coordinated human action. She recommended no further investigation. The incident was covered briefly in the San Juan Islander, the local weekly newspaper. The article ran on July 25th under the headline, "Mystery Sound Startles Friday Harbor." It quoted several witnesses and noted that no explanation had been found. The piece generated letters to the editor, some suggesting pranksters, others atmospheric conditions, one proposing divine intervention. None offered verifiable evidence. The event faded from conversation. By August, it was a local oddity, mentioned occasionally but not dwelled upon. Life returned to normal until July 19, 1990, when it happened again, same date, same time, 11:03 a.m. Every bell, horn, and chime in Friday Harbor sounded together for approximately 7 seconds. The sound was identical, layered, precise, harmonious in a way that defied randomness. Margaret Lindstrom, still working at the library, recognized it immediately. She stepped outside and stood on the lawn, listening. Other residents emerged from shops and homes, drawn by the sound. They stood in the street, looking around, searching for a source or explanation. Richard Kowalski was at the dock again. He had remembered the 1985 event and half expected something might happen, though he had told no one. When the horn sounded, he felt a chill despite the summer warmth. "I'd been waiting for it," he said later. "I don't know why, but I wasn't surprised." This time the response was more organized. The sheriff's office dispatched deputies to check each sound source. The clock tower, the churches, the ferry terminal, all systems appeared to function normally. No mechanical triggers could be identified. No timers, no remote controls. The technology of 1990 did not allow for such coordination without physical infrastructure, and no such infrastructure existed. The newspaper covered the event more thoroughly. The July 26, 1990 edition of the San Juan Islander featured a front-page article, "Strange Sound Returns After 5 Years." The piece noted the 1985 occurrence and interviewed witnesses from both events. It raised the possibility of a pattern, something recurring on a 5-year cycle. A local engineer, Martin Curry, wrote a letter to the editor suggesting electromagnetic interference or atmospheric conditions might cause simultaneous activation of mechanical systems. The letter acknowledged this was speculative and that he could not explain the 7-second duration or the 5-year interval. In 1991, a physics professor from the University of Washington, Dr. Samuel Orendane, visited Friday Harbor to investigate. He interviewed witnesses, examined the sound-producing mechanisms, and reviewed meteorological data from both July 1985 and July 1990. He found no atmospheric anomalies. He found no electromagnetic disturbances. He found no mechanism by which independent, non-electronic systems could synchronize. His informal conclusion, shared with the newspaper but never formally published, was that the events were either an extraordinary coincidence or the result of unknown factors not accounted for in current scientific models. He did not speculate further. July 19, 1995, came with anticipation. Some residents made plans to be in town, curious whether the pattern would hold. At 11:03 a.m., the sound returned. Same duration, same layered quality, same inexplicable precision. By now, the event had attracted regional attention. A television crew from Seattle visited later that summer to film a segment for a local news program. They interviewed residents, recorded the sound sources individually, and attempted to recreate the synchrony by manually triggering everything at once. They could not replicate the effect. The manual attempt sounded chaotic, dissonant, nothing like the natural event. In 2000, the pattern repeated. July 19th, 11:03 a.m., 7 seconds. The sound arrived as it had before, and by now, dozens of people had gathered in anticipation. They stood in the street, in the park, along the waterfront, listening. Some recorded the event on video cameras. The footage shows people standing silently, looking up, as the bells and horns sound together. After 2000, the synchrony stopped. July 19, 2005, passed without incident. Residents who had gathered to listen heard nothing unusual. The same in 2010. The pattern, if it had been a pattern, was broken. In 2007, an acoustic researcher named Dr. Anja Peltonen analyzed recordings from the 2000 event. She noted that the sound, while appearing simultaneous to human ears, showed slight variations in timing when examined with precision instruments, differences measured in milliseconds. But the variations were so small that they created the perception of perfect synchrony. She could not explain how independent mechanical systems, operated by different mechanisms and maintained by different people, could achieve such coordination. In 2012, the San Juan Historical Museum held a small exhibit on unexplained events in island history. The Friday Harbor Synchrony was included, along with photographs, witness statements, and newspaper clippings. The exhibit attracted modest interest. Most visitors treated it as a curiosity, something strange that had happened, and then stopped. Margaret Lindstrom, retired by then, visited the exhibit. She stood for a long time in front of the display, reading the accounts, remembering the sound. A museum volunteer asked if she had been there for the events. Lindstrom nodded. 4 times, she said, 1985, 1995, and 2000. I heard it each time, and I still don't know what it was. The volunteer asked if she thought it would happen again. Lindstrom shook her head. I think whatever it was, it said what it needed to say. 4 times. And then it stopped. Richard Kowalski passed away in 2016. In his personal effects, his family found a journal entry dated July 19, 2000. He had written, "The sound came again today, same as always. I stood at the dock and listened. It's the only time I've ever felt like the whole town was speaking one sentence together, but I don't know what the sentence was." Friday Harbor remains the same. The clock tower still chimes the hours. The church bells ring for services. The ferry horn sounds when boats depart. They operate independently, as they always have, controlled by separate hands and separate mechanisms. But on some quiet mornings in July, longtime residents will pause and listen, not expecting anything, but remembering a time when every sound in town aligned into a single voice that no one had summoned and no one could explain. And they wonder sometimes whether it was the town that spoke, or something else that used the town to speak through, because the sound had been too perfect, too deliberate, too much like language without words, and whatever it said it 4 times, once every 5 years, and then fell silent, as though the message had finally been received. Some construction happens without builders, and some builders work only when no one is watching. Susha Island is a marine state park in the northernmost reaches of the San Juan archipelago, a crescent-shaped landmass of sandstone cliffs, pebbled beaches, and dense coastal forest. The island is accessible only by private boat, drawing kayakers, sailors, and day hikers who come for the solitude and the dramatic geology. There are no roads, no permanent structures beyond a few weather-beaten picnic shelters built by the state in the 1970s. The park sees heaviest use in summer, but even then, overnight visitors rarely number more than a few dozen. The island's trails wind through madrone groves and along bluffs that drop sharply to the water. Campsites are primitive, cleared patches of ground with fire rings and little else. Park rangers visit weekly during the season, checking permits, maintaining trails, and removing unauthorized structures. The island has rules. Pack out what you pack in, disturb nothing, leave no trace. But starting in the summer of 2016, something began leaving traces that no one could account for. The first shelter was found by a kayaker named Daniel Rousseau on June 14, 2016. Rousseau had beached his kayak at Fossil Bay on the island's eastern shore and hiked inland toward Echo Bay, a route he had walked the previous day. Near the midpoint of the trail, he encountered a lean-to shelter that had not been there 24 hours earlier. The structure was simple but well made, a slanted roof of interlocking driftwood branches supported by two vertical posts with a back wall woven from smaller sticks and bark. It stood roughly 6 feet tall and 8 feet wide, large enough to shelter several people. The construction showed skill. The joints were tight. The roof angled efficiently to shed rain, but there were no nails, no rope, no metal fasteners of any kind. The wood had been fitted together using notches and friction alone. Rousseau photographed the shelter and continued his hike. He assumed it had been built by other campers, though he wondered why they would have gone to such effort for a temporary structure. When he returned to the mainland, he mentioned it to a friend who worked for Washington State Parks. The friend, a ranger named Victoria Mendez, noted the report but did not investigate immediately. Unauthorized structures were occasionally built by campers and removed during routine patrols. On June 21st, Mendez visited Sucia Island for her weekly inspection. She found the shelter Rousseau had described and dismantled it, scattering the wood back into the forest. She left a note at the trailhead reminding visitors that building structures in state parks was prohibited. On June 28th, another shelter appeared. This one was located near the southern end of the island along the trail to Shallow Bay. A hiker named Patricia Okafor reported it to Mendez. Okafor had walked the trail the previous afternoon and seen nothing. The next morning, the shelter was there. Same driftwood construction, same precise joinery, no fasteners. Mendez dismantled it and began keeping a log. Over the next 3 months, 7 more shelters appeared on Sucia Island. Each was found in a different location. Each was constructed from driftwood using the same technique. Each appeared overnight or within a narrow window when no hikers reported being on the trail. The shelters showed no signs of hasty assembly. The wood was weathered, as though it had been collected over time and allowed to dry. The joints fit cleanly. The structures were stable. Mendez tested one by leaning her full weight against it, and it did not shift. In September 2016, Mendez contacted her supervisor and requested guidance. The supervisor, Thomas Houle, visited the island and examined one of the shelters before Mendez dismantled it. He noted the craftsmanship and the absence of tools or fasteners. He also noted that the locations were remote, far from the main campsites, often off-trail or in areas with limited visibility. Houle authorized Mendez to install a motion-activated trail camera near one of the sites where shelters had repeatedly appeared. The camera was positioned to cover a section of trail near Fox Cove, where 2 shelters had been found within a month. The device was set to record video and audio whenever motion was detected. On the night of September 23, 2016, the camera activated. The timestamp showed 2:47 a.m. The video showed nothing, only darkness and the faint outline of trees illuminated by the camera's infrared LED. The motion sensor had been triggered, but no person, animal, or movement was visible in the frame. The audio, however, told a different story. For 16 minutes, the microphone recorded the sound of hammering, not the sharp metallic clang of a hammer on nails, but the rhythmic thud of wood striking wood, measured, repetitive, methodical. The sound was consistent in tempo and volume, as though someone were driving wooden stakes or fitting joints with a mallet. But the video showed no one, no light source, no shadow moving through the frame. Mendez reviewed the footage 3 times. She played the audio for Juan. Both agreed the sound was genuine and that it indicated construction activity, but the camera had captured no visual evidence of who or what was making the sound. The next morning, a new shelter stood 20 yards from the camera, just outside the frame's field of view. It was the largest yet, 10 feet wide, 7 feet tall, with a roof carefully layered to create overlapping channels for water runoff. Mendez examined the ground around it for footprints, tool marks, or debris. She found nothing. The forest floor was undisturbed beyond the immediate area of the shelter. Juan reported the findings to Washington State Parks, headquarters in Olympia. A memo was circulated among regional staff, noting the shelters and the unexplained audio recording. The memo requested that additional rangers monitor the island and report any sightings of individuals engaged in unauthorized construction. No sightings were reported. In October 2016, a wildlife biologist named Dr. Helen Vargas visited Sucia Island to study deer populations. She was aware of the shelter reports and asked Mendez if she could review the trail camera footage. Vargas specialized in animal behavior and wondered if the shelters might be constructed by an unknown or misidentified species, though she acknowledged this was unlikely. After reviewing the footage, Vargas noted that the hammering sound was too regular to be natural. "If this were an animal," she said, "you'd expect variation, pauses, changes in rhythm, environmental interruptions. This sounds deliberate and sustained. It sounds human, but I can't explain why there's no one on the video." Vargas also examined one of the shelters before it was dismantled. She noted that the driftwood pieces were sorted by size and shape, as though selected for specific structural purposes. "This isn't random," she said. "Someone, or something, understands basic engineering." In November, as the weather turned colder and visitor numbers dropped, Mendez continued her patrols. She found 2 more shelters, both in locations she had checked days earlier. Both were empty. Both showed the same precise construction. She dismantled them and filed reports with the state. In December 2016, state parks decided to halt active monitoring. Juan informed Mendez that the shelters, while unusual, posed no safety risk and that resources could not be dedicated to investigating a phenomenon that had caused no harm. Mendez was instructed to continue routine patrols and dismantle any shelter she found, but no further trail cameras or investigations would be authorized. The shelters continued to appear through 2017 and 2018. Mendez kept informal records. By the end of 2018, she had documented and dismantled 31 shelters across Sucia Island. The pattern remained consistent. They appeared overnight, always used driftwood, always lacked fasteners, and always demonstrated skilled construction. In 2019, Mendez was reassigned to a different park. Her replacement, a ranger named Marcus Johansson, was briefed on the shelter phenomenon but was skeptical. "I've worked in parks for 15 years, he told Juan. "People build things. It's what they do. Someone's out there doing this, and they're good at not getting caught." Johansson conducted his own investigation. He reviewed Mendez's notes and the trail camera footage. He interviewed hikers and kayakers who frequented Sucia Island. No one reported seeing anyone building shelters. No one reported hearing construction sounds at night. The island was small enough that sustained activity should have been noticed. In July 2019, Johansen installed 3 trail cameras at different locations on the island. All 3 were motion-activated with infrared night vision. Over the course of 2 weeks, one camera captured the same phenomenon Mendez had documented, audio of hammering at 2:47 a.m. with no corresponding visual activity. Johansen dismantled the shelter that appeared near the camera. He examined it closely, looking for clues about the builder's identity. The wood was dry and weathered. The joints showed no tool marks, only the smooth wear of wood fitted against wood. He found no fingerprints, no fabric fibers, no footprints. He stopped installing cameras after that. By 2020, the shelters had become part of the island's unspoken lore. Rangers dismantled them when they appeared. Hikers occasionally encountered them and posted photographs online, speculating about their origin. The most common theory was that a skilled craftsman visited the island periodically to practice traditional building techniques and preferred to work at night to avoid attention. But no one ever saw the craftsman. No boats were reported anchored near the island during the nights when shelters appeared. No campers reported hearing activity. And the hammering sound, recorded twice on separate occasions, remained unexplained. In 2022, Marcus Johansen retired. In his final report to Washington State Parks, he included a section on the Sutia Island shelters. He wrote, "I do not know who builds these structures or why they appear where and when they do. I have dismantled dozens of them. They will continue to appear. Future rangers should be aware that this is a persistent phenomenon with no clear explanation. The shelters still appear. Rangers still dismantle them. And on certain nights, if you camp on Sutia Island and wake in the early hours, you might hear it. The steady rhythmic sound of wood striking wood, echoing through the forest from a direction you cannot pinpoint. No light will guide you to the source. No footprints will mark the trail. But in the morning, somewhere on the island, there will be a new shelter, standing where nothing stood the day before, built by hands that leave no trace except the work itself. And it will be empty, as they always are, waiting for no one." The ocean keeps time perfectly, everywhere, except where it has chosen not to. Waldron Island is the most isolated of the inhabited San Juan Islands, a windswept rectangle of rocky shoreline and open prairie, accessible only by private boat or float plane. No ferry serves it. No public docks accommodate visitors. The island's year-round population has never exceeded 50, mostly families who value self-sufficiency and distance from mainland rhythms. There is a one-room schoolhouse, a volunteer fire department, and a community center that doubles as a general store. Life on Waldron follows the tides, the seasons, and the unspoken agreements of people who must rely on each other. The northern beach is the island's most exposed coastline, facing the open waters of the Strait of Georgia, where Canadian and American boundaries meet in cold, deep channels. The beach is rocky, strewn with driftwood and kelp, bordered by low bluffs covered in salal and shore pine. It is not a place for recreation. The currents are strong, the water frigid year-round, and the nearest help is miles away by boat. But it is a place that fishermen, boaters, and the few residents of the northern shore have relied on for decades to understand when the tide will rise and fall. And since 1967, that understanding has been quietly, persistently wrong. The discrepancy was first noted by a commercial fisherman named Leonard Takahashi in July 1967. Takahashi operated a gill netter out of Waldron and kept meticulous records of tide times to plan his work. He used NOAA tide tables, the standard reference for mariners in the Pacific Northwest, which predicted tides based on harmonic analysis of lunar and solar gravitational effects. On July 12th, Takahashi anchored off the northern beach to wait for high tide, planning to retrieve crab pots set near the shore. The tide table predicted high tide at 6:17 a.m. Takahashi arrived at 6:10 and waited. The water continued to rise past 6:17. It continued rising until 6:40 a.m., 23 minutes later than predicted. Takahashi assumed he had misread the tables or miscalculated the local correction factor, but when he checked the tables again and consulted with other fishermen, he found no error. The predictions were accurate for every other location in the San Juans. Only the northern beach of Waldron was off. Over the following months, Takahashi documented the anomaly. Every high tide on the northern beach arrived 23 minutes later than NOAA predicted. Low tides showed the same delay. The lag was consistent day after day, month after month. Adjacent beaches on Waldron, less than a mile east or west, followed the predictions accurately. The delay affected only a 600-yard stretch of the northern shore. In October 1967, Takahashi contacted NOAA's Seattle office and reported the discrepancy. A junior technician thanked him for the information and suggested that local bathymetry, underwater topography, might cause tidal variations. Takahashi was told the matter would be reviewed. No review occurred. In 1972, a marine surveyor named Evelyn Marquardt was contracted by San Juan County to update nautical charts for the islands. Marquardt was thorough and experienced, having worked on coastal surveys for 15 years. When she reached Waldron Island, she conducted her own tidal observations to verify chart data. She encountered the same anomaly Takahashi had reported. High tides at the northern beach consistently arrived 23 minutes late. Marquardt checked her instruments. She verified her position with celestial navigation. She compared her observations with tide predictions for neighboring locations. Everything was accurate except the northern beach. Marquardt included the discrepancy in her report to the county, noting it as an unexplained tidal lag requiring further investigation. The county forwarded the report to NOAA. A response came 3 months later, stating that localized tidal variations are common in complex coastal environments and do not warrant revision of regional tide tables. The anomaly remained. By the 1980s, the delayed tides had become common knowledge among Waldron residents and regular visitors. Fishermen adjusted their schedules. Boaters planning to beach their vessels on the northern shore added 23 minutes to NOAA predictions. The island's informal tide calendar, posted in the community center, included a handwritten note. North Beach, add 23 minutes. In 1989, a group of oceanography students from the University of Washington visited Waldron Island as part of a field study on tidal dynamics. Their professor, Dr. Samuel Orendane, had heard about the northern beach anomaly and wanted to investigate. The students deployed tide gauges at 3 locations: the northern beach, a control site on the eastern shore, and a second control site 1 mile west of the northern beach. They recorded water levels continuously for 2 weeks. The data confirmed the anomaly. The northern beach showed a consistent 23-minute lag. The control sites matched NOAA predictions within normal tolerances. Dr. Orendane analyzed the data and proposed several hypotheses. He considered underwater ridges that might slow incoming tidal currents. He considered freshwater outflow from streams that might alter salinity and buoyancy. He considered standing waves or resonance effects in the local bathymetry. None of the hypotheses fit the observed pattern. A hydrographic survey conducted in 1990, using sonar to map the seafloor off the northern beach, revealed no unusual features. The bottom was gently sloping rock and gravel, typical of the region. There were no channels, no ridges, no depressions that could account for the delay. Dr. Orendane published a brief paper in the Journal of Coastal Research in 1992 titled Anomalous Tidal Lag at Waldron Island, Washington, an Unexplained Coastal Phenomenon. The paper documented the 23-minute delay, presented the hydrographic data, and concluded that no conventional oceanographic mechanism adequately explains the observed lag. The paper was cited occasionally in subsequent studies on tidal prediction accuracy, but generated no follow-up research. The northern beach of Waldron Island was too small, too remote, and too unimportant to justify the expense of further investigation. In 2003, NOAA upgraded its tidal prediction models using satellite data and improved computational techniques. The new models were tested against historical observations from hundreds of coastal stations. Waldron Island's northern beach was included in the data set. The models failed to predict the 23-minute lag. Engineers at NOAA reviewed the input data, recalculated the harmonic constants, and ran the models again. The results were identical. The northern beach behaved as though it were subject to a gravitational or hydrodynamic force that did not exist anywhere else in the region. A memo circulated internally at NOAA in October 2003, noting the anomaly and recommending it be flagged for future study. The memo acknowledged that the lag cannot be explained by current models, but suggested it was likely the result of unmapped subsurface topography or localized current patterns. No study was initiated. In 2009, a retired naval engineer named Arthur Delgado moved to Waldron Island. Delgado had worked on submarine navigation systems and had a deep understanding of how tides and currents affect underwater acoustics and positioning. He became interested in the northern beach anomaly and began his own investigation. Delgado spent a year collecting data. He measured tide times with precision instruments. He mapped currents using drift buoys. He interviewed longtime residents who had observed the tides for decades. His conclusion was stark. The delay is real, consistent, and inexplicable. It doesn't behave like a tidal lag caused by topography or friction. It behaves like the water itself is waiting. Delgado submitted his findings to NOAA in 2010, along with a request for a formal investigation. His submission was acknowledged with a brief email stating that the anomaly is noted in our records, and that resources are allocated to investigations with navigational safety implications. Waldron Island's northern beach posed no safety hazard. Boats adjusted, fishermen adapted, life continued, but Delgado could not let it go. In a letter to Dr. Orendane, written in 2012, he wrote, "I've worked with tides my entire career. I understand phase shifts, harmonic delays, resonance. This isn't any of those things. The water arrives 23 minutes late, every time, with a precision that suggests intention. I don't know what that means, but I know it's not natural." Dr. Orendane, by then retired, responded cautiously. He agreed the phenomenon was unusual, but suggested that nature contains complexities we have not yet modeled. He noted that science often encountered unexplained observations that were later resolved with better data or new theories. He did not speculate beyond that. In 2015, a filmmaker producing a documentary on the San Juan Islands visited Waldron and interviewed residents about the northern beach. Most spoke of it matter-of-factly, as a quirk of local geography. One longtime resident, Margaret Tolliver, offered a different perspective. "My grandfather used to say, 'The North Beach has always been late,'" she told the filmmaker. "He didn't mean just the tides. He meant everything. Storms hit it later than they should. Ice forms later in winter. Even the light seems to reach it last." He said it was like that part of the island was living a little behind the rest of the world. Tolliver's grandfather had died in 1976. He had lived on Waldron since the 1920s. There is no written record of his observations, only Tolliver's memory of his words. The northern beach of Waldron Island remains unchanged. The tide still arrives 23 minutes late. Twice a day, every day, the water rises and falls on a schedule that belongs only to that 600-yard stretch of stone and kelp. NOAA's predictions remain inaccurate. The hydrographic surveys show nothing unusual. The 23-minute delay persists with a precision that has not varied by more than 8 seconds in over 50 years of observation. Fishermen still adjust their schedules. Residents still add the minutes by hand to their calendars. And on quiet mornings when the tide is rising and the strait is calm, some stand on the bluffs and watch the water climb the rocks, slowly, deliberately, 23 minutes behind the rest of the world, as if it is waiting for something that has not yet arrived, or as if it remembers something the rest of the ocean has forgotten.